Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. The meeting will now come to order. Hello, I'm Donna Savigny, President of the Board of Education, and I would like to welcome you to the June 24th, 2020 special board meeting. In keeping with the board's commitment to open communication with the community, this meeting is being streamed live on the CCPS website at www.carrollk12.org and broadcast live on Channel 21. We are also recording this meeting so that it can be accessed on demand on our website and broadcast throughout the month on Channel 21. Due to the coronavirus pandemic impacting our county and community, the Board of Education will continue to conduct our meetings in a virtual format until the pandemic abates and the appropriate restrictions that are in place are lifted. Unfortunately, these adjustments do not make it possible for live public participation during the meetings. Citizens may watch the meeting live on Channel 21 or our website, but do not have the opportunity to speak during the meeting. The Board, however, remains very interested in receiving public input on the topics we discuss. Therefore, we encourage citizens to provide comments to the board via email. Alternatively, citizens may send written comments to the board through the U.S. mail. For board members and staff who are participating in the virtual meeting, I would remind us to all silence our cell phones and other devices around us that the microphones may pick up. Also, we should each silence our microphones when we are not speaking. Now, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you, everyone. Board members, to start things off, I need a motion for the approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Battaglia, seconded by Dr. Dorsey. Board members, any comments or revisions? No? Then I will call for the vote. All those in favor, if I can get a verbal aye, please.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, and so that brings us up to the public participation section, which we had just discussed. Dr. Lockhart, has there been any information that we have posted to the website?
I have not received any, unless Ms. Gaddis, you got something just recently. I'll wait for her to chime in, but I don't believe we received anything. She usually tells me if we have.
So no public participation requests for things to be posted for this particular meeting?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Then we can move on to Section 3 for discussion, and the one and only item we've got for tonight, although it will have many, many subparts, I am sure, is the COVID-19 impact update. So Dr. Lockhart, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, board members, our student representative, Devanshi Mistry is here with us this evening. We have several staff members on the line. And so one agenda item, but a very big one. It seems like 3 weeks ago, I sent a message to the community that the school year has come to an end. That was actually at the beginning of last week. Now that the school year has come to an end, we've already been working to shift our focus about what happens at the beginning of next year. But I laid out some information for the community as it relates to some of the planning that's already underway and some of the complexities of that planning as it relates to the circumstances connected to COVID-19, the potential restrictions or considerations we have to adhere to. And so tonight, while we won't come to a final decision about what the first day of school for Carroll County Public Schools will look like on September 8th, 2020, which is a mere 68 days away, we are going to have conversation around all those complexities and considerations and requirements, some potential requirements, because again, trying to look 6 days ahead, yet alone 68 days ahead, is kind of challenging when stuff changes all the time. But we want to get into and really dissect all those complexities, considerations, requirements upon us. We're going to talk about the process being used. Like I said, I laid that out in a community message. We are engaging stakeholder groups. We are asking our community for feedback. We'll continue with that. We're going to be communicating throughout the summer. We're going to go through the timeline. This Board of Education will meet, I think it's 6 times in the next month and a half. And if we need to meet more than that, we certainly will. But there's going to be a lot of ongoing, continuous conversation around this topic about the fall. And so tonight we want to really, like I said, dive into that, start to unpack it. There's a big gray area between being fully back in school in stage 3 and being completely virtual like we were this past spring. That is our challenge. That is the area that we will wrestle with. I'm very appreciative of the community's input, of the hundreds of emails that I know I've received, that other folks have received, where folks are expressing what they'd like to see happen, where they're talking about what works for their kids, all the challenges associated with that. We completely understand that complexity, which is why we want to walk through those and talk through those this evening. And so we have a lot of team members here to help us as we get into the specifics and the logistics. I think Mr. Singer from the Health Department is on this call. I don't see him here, but I believe he's here.
I'm here, Steve.
Thank you, Ed. Michael Duffy, our Supervisor of Athletics, because there's a lot of conversation from MPSSAA and considerations for our student athletes, and of course all the cabinet members and staff that are typically with us. So I don't want to talk too much longer. I want to make sure we get to the real important things here. And John, I believe you have the control of the slide deck. But board members, I'm going to ask you, I gave you that outline ahead of time. I certainly will. It goes without asking. I know you're going to engage with the questions and comments. So please stop us where you have a question, a comment, a thought, an idea, a consideration, so that we can walk through that. So I have see that John has been able to go ahead and get that slide there. And John, if you want to go ahead and progress to that planning process for some background information, that would be helpful.
Are you seeing
John,
that?
are you on mute? Oh, there we go.
Is everybody able to see the screen as we go?
Yes.
Okay, great. And President Savigny, Dr. Lockhart, board members, good evening and thank you. President Savigny, a point of order, if we may. There's an item that's been part of your discussions with us, with Dr. Lockhart and staff, that's really not specified in this plan, which really is sort of looking towards the September reopening plan, that I'm fearful I'll forget if we leave it till the end. And if okay, I'd like to bring that up now with you, and that is the use of outside fields as part of the formal use of facilities process. Starting in this summer, that's something that we had shut down all of use of facilities with the initial school closure or soon thereafter. And I know each of you's had a lot of conversation with us, and Dr. Locker certainly favorable to reinstituting use of facilities for the outside fields, not for building use yet. We've talked, Mr. Prokops and Mr. Duffy have talked to staff at schools. We'd be prepared to start that formal process of approving use of outside fields as early as Monday, if that's the full board's will.
So, John, thanks for bringing that up, and I know it is definitely a COVID-related topic, so I think it's fine to be addressing it now. So we know that we were saying that Parks and Rec primarily were able to use the fields. We just weren't issuing permits, right? But our position was that Parks and Rec were able to use the fields while we were not issuing permits.
Sure. Any individuals for that matter, but certainly Rec and Parks. We had just sort of shut down the formal approval process. Folks are always able to use the grounds. It's just a matter of both permitting and the approval, but then also, I guess, following the formal guidelines of priority use becomes a factor. So we've been having this conversation with Rec and Parks as well, and certainly Mr. Deggets would support us reinstituting formal use of facilities approval for the outside grounds.
Okay. And what is the timeline that you said that was going to start happening?
We're prepared to do that effective Monday, so the very next week following this meeting. Mr. Prokop and Mr. Duffy have already talked to schools so that they're aware this would be coming. We've had some conversation with Mr. Deggets, but obviously after tonight we would formally notify everybody, Parks and Rec and all the schools and the folks at the school level. It's usually the athletic directors at the high schools and the administrators at the middle and elementary would be prepared to begin that process Monday.
Mr. Kyla, did you have some questions or some comments that you'd like to make?
I guess the first comment would be thanks for everybody pitching in and making this happen. There's a lot of people that want to use fields. I wasn't part of the conversation, but Sheriff DeWeese told Ms. Herbert that there was a lot of kids at North Carroll High School this past weekend, and he implied some were inside, but that's not CCPS's building, so that's not up to us. But yeah, no, thanks for everybody doing it, and I think the sooner the better. The blanket statement about field use was great, and I think people didn't kind of realize it, but they're so used to having that approved form, and that saves a lot of fights over who's supposed to be there and who isn't. And some of them were also worried that if they didn't have the form, they weren't covered by liability. Jeff Deggets has assured them they are, and so I think we've crossed that hurdle. And you said you notify them, you notify the schools. Is it appropriate to put a blip on the website about this too?
We certainly can do that. We'll work with Ms. Gaddis to get either a scrolling banner or whatever she tells us is the most effective way to do that. We'll make that happen.
So in a nutshell, the board doesn't have to do anything at all, and I hate to say this, but you're like a week ahead of us as usual, and we're just hearing about it.
I don't believe you would need to take action. It's a process that we would turn back on, and certainly Dr. Lockard had moved us in that direction, so we know we can make it happen everywhere on Monday.
So just in the meantime, from Thursday to Sunday, I guess, folks are still free to use all of the fields. It's just that there would not be any approved forms or permits or anything like that. But come Monday, it will be the standard process that folks are used to.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks for helping everyone to get that done, because I do understand being in athletics, those permits are important. That gives them security. They know that they can use that field X amount of days during the week and what times, and then there's no controversy. And we really need to get our students out and engaging in athletics. So thank you.
Thank you.
And if I may make just one more comment, and everybody on this meeting knows that, but those user groups also do so much for the fields. They put down ball diamond mix, they mow, they put in foul lines, and some of those, back when we saw the memo and they realized the governor was allowing them on the field, some of them have already spent 2 weekends working on the field. So I think those user groups are great for us, and hopefully we're great for them.
And Kenny, that is so true, because they have built dugouts and reseeding, and they really work hard to keep those grounds up and running. So yes, it's a two-way street, and it's a great partnership. And yes, I did talk to Mr. DeWeese today, and he said yes, there were a lot of kids over there at North Carroll over the weekend, because I went to bus patrol this morning and saw him, and he said there was a lot.
Great. Well, thank you all. And now that we have that out of the way, I'm so afraid I'd forget it a few hours from now. So
I have a question, though, concerning it, if I might.
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, certainly, we understand the service that the Rec Council provides and all the other athletic groups to the communities. I'm just wondering, do we know, because we still are in this pandemic, so do we know how the fields are going to be used?
If, Dr. Dorsey, if I can say a few things. I've talked through the last couple of weeks with Jeff Daggett of Rec and Parks, and the governor released them to do youth activities. There's still some restrictions, and in my opinion, at least for the Rec and Parks programs, they will control that they follow guidelines as they use the fields. And for the next groups, I'm not sure, and Mr. Neal, if you can say that, I understand the first two priorities are school groups. The next is Parks and Rec. Then after that, other groups can use the facilities, have to present insurance, but I guess you guys will tell them they have to abide by the governor's guidelines, correct?
Correct. And we would always expect and hope that everyone will abide by whatever the existing laws are at the moment when they're on our grounds. And so this would just be another set of expectations that people generally need to be aware that these executive orders are in effect and need to be adhered to. And that would be true for individual users who've been on the ground since March. Each of us is supposed to follow what the authorities say, and so we hope that people will do that.
Dr. Dorsey, is that where you were headed, or did we change the subject?
I mean, you can move on to the next subject, certainly. I just didn't know, again, I mean, I've seen some of the information, like, you can involve kids in, like, some of the training and conditioning and that kind of thing. And I just didn't know whether, Recs and Parks had provided any other information as far as how they are actually planning to use the field, and are they limiting the number of users, that kind of thing is what I was questioning.
Sure. Yeah, Dr. Dorsey, I can't speak specifically to the guidance. I know that I've seen communications that have gone out from Mr. Daggett and the folks at Rec and Parks that have the latest executive orders and the interpretive guidance, which sometimes changes from week to week even. So I know that they are providing that to the rec councils. I have seen, copies of that have gone out.
And that has been one of the issues, no different than us trying to figure out how to open schools in September. They require each program that wants to use a field to have a plan developed on how they're going to use it and how they're going to abide. But what I think's happened a little bit with the individual rec councils, they put together a plan, they submit it, it gets approved, the governor has another press conference, and the rules have gotten better, not worse. And that's one of the comments I know staff at Parks and Rec have made to programs. Your guidelines look great, but you're actually being too strict. We can now go a step further, just like you guys are trying to do with use of schools. It's an ongoing thing. But they are required to do a written plan.
I know a lot of the rec councils, too, are trying to decide if they need to do soccer signups or fall softball, fall baseball, potentially looking into the winter for winter sports. So they're trying to figure out if they need to do those signups and if they're going to be able to have field usage for those programs. So I know they're having a difficulty with that because that's something that I'm hearing from my kids' own programs. They're trying to figure out what they can and can't do, and should they plan, should they not? So it is a struggle.
All right. Well, very good, and thank you all for that. We will make that get underway, and now some really heavy topics to come. So we have a bunch of slides just to try to frame some highlights and guide a discussion. But we'd like to say up front that this is a discussion that we all personally know, all of us on this call, from having spent hours upon hours in different planning meetings of our own. It's a lot to take in, and it's, you know, really start to delve into what has to be thought through in order to have a plan for opening schools in some modified way. You know, with each conversation, more and more things come up that are great questions and great topics to be discussed. And so this is the first of many meetings. We'll have the timeline on the screen in a minute. But I guess what we'd like to say to you, for Dr. Lockhart and all of the staff here tonight, is if ever there was going to be a presentation where we, the presenters, would welcome being interrupted as often as possible with great questions and feedback and observations. Tonight's probably that night more than anyone ever, and so please don't hesitate to stop us, to ask, to seek clarification, to offer thoughts and input, and we'll do our best to answer with everything we can up to the moment. These first couple of slides are just meant to be background, maybe fill out a little bit more of some of Dr. Locker's introductory comments. So we're not going to spend a ton of time up front, but when we get to the survey and then especially survey data and then especially beyond, a lot of really heavy things there to think through with us. So with that, Dr. Lockhart mentioned that we have a formal process, and in summary that's being displayed on the screen. He early in June, he asked Cabinet to shift from sort of finishing out the school year to planning for the reopening following the state guidance, and directed Cabinet to kind of be the coordinating body for that. But it's not only Cabinet members involved in that work. And then that process led us into sort of 3 functional work groups, and you see what the focus of those groups are. Just for disclosure's sake, the Operational Logistics and Safety Work Group, Mr. Mike Hardesty is the chair of that group. The Academics, Equity, and Accountability Work Group, Mr. Jason Anderson is chairing that work group, and Cindy McCabe is chairing the Schools and Student Support work group. And you'll be hearing from Mike and Jason and Cindy tonight as we go through this. Vetting everything we're working on through the key stakeholders of parents and students and employees and others is a key part of the state's requirements for us, and something we'd obviously want to do anyway. And so you can see some of the representative stakeholder groups that we've identified to vet our work through as it unfolds over the next few weeks and months. And that doesn't mean those are the only groups that can and will weigh in, but those are some of the ones that we are intentionally reaching out to, and that includes your advisory councils, the employee representative groups, the Student Government Association, members of the local emergency management community, and Mr. Singer, who continues to hang in there with us, and somebody from our organization is probably in touch with him more than once a day, to the point that he probably cringes when his phone screen lights up. But you know, we're in constant contact with him, and he's going to be getting everything that comes out of a committee before it eventually ends up in a plan. In addition to your formal July meeting, there are several meetings, and they're on a screen coming up, set up just to have this kind of public conversation with you and hear from you and answer your questions and let you know where we are as a committee working. And then communication will be ongoing throughout. Ms. Gaddis has already sent out some messages. She'll probably send out, after each one of these updates, a community feedback message saying, here's the presentation, here's the link to the video, please send in your thoughts and your reaction to anything we've talked about. And as Dr. Lockhart said, people are already doing that, and so that's great. Here's the general timeline as we understand it right now. The state is requiring that every local school system have a plan and have it approved by August 4th, have it not only approved but posted on our website by, I believe the date is August 14th. And so here's a timeline that Dr. Lockhart's worked with you on to try to draft out a way to get from here to there. And so we've talked a little bit about some of these things. I'm going to skip the survey for now because Ms. McCabe is going to cover the results of that survey in a moment. But we have the meeting tonight. You have at least 3 more meetings scheduled just for the sole purpose of this kind of presentation, question and answer and discussion. And then hopefully by that August 5th date, we'd be able to bring you a plan that's been fully vetted and hopefully ready for approval. We're shooting right now for having a draft plan, a rough draft of the document for your July 15 meeting. So that is our goal going in. And as I said, stakeholder feedback will be ongoing. And in fact, I know that at least one, if not more, of the work groups have already sent out a good bit of information to those stakeholders on the prior screen to say, hey, here's some of the things we've come up with so far. What's your reaction to these things? And that's a heavy lift for folks because there's a lot of things to react to, and you'll be seeing some of that tonight. Like I said, we did do an initial community survey, and I think we probably had two global reasons for that. One was just to sort of let people know this is really underway, and please join us and pay attention and know that things will be coming out. And then secondly was kind of to just get sort of an initial temperature check on what folks might be thinking and feeling about kind of the major points of reopening. So these next few slides, Ms. McCabe, if she's there, will walk you through.
I'm here. So yeah, let's talk about the surveys a little bit. They went out last week to parents and employees. And as John said, this was an initial way of us getting some input from parents and employees. And it also alerted folks that we are starting the process of looking toward the fall and about how we will be reopening schools. Again, this was just a global look at how people are feeling right now, almost a temperature check as we start the process of planning. So, John, can you go to the next slide? There we go. So let's talk about the parent results first. For the return rate for parents, we had 49.4% as our return rate. And the first question really talked about how parents were feeling about returning their children to school. And you'll see that in the first bar graph there. So comfort level about returning students to school, 49% of parents feel comfortable reopening for all. 33% of parents feel comfortable reopening in some kind of limited manner, and 18% prefer us to continue with virtual instruction. If you look
Ms. McCabe, that middle bar of the comfortable reopening in a limited manner, the limited is kind of a loose term, right? That we don't really know what limited means, right?
Right.
Okay.
It could look differently, and we're going to get to that a little bit later in our slides. We'll talk a little bit about what a limited or phased-in process would look like for us as CCPS. For the second bar graph, that looked at bus transportation, because we all know on buses, students, that's another area where students are interacting with one another and in close proximity. So 36% of parents felt comfortable with their students riding the bus in the traditional manner. 28% felt comfortable with students being one to a seat. And 36% said that they plan to drive their children to school in the fall. So those were the two questions that really asked about comfort level with reopening the schools and use of buses. You can go to the next slide. Next, we asked parents about factors that would influence their decision or their comfort level in sending their children back to school in the fall. So basically the question is, are these a factor in your comfort level or your decision? And so I'm just going to quickly go through what those factors were. The first one was level of restrictions in place. So when we look at that factor, we look at things like masks, social distancing, restrictions that we all have become familiar with through the CDC and through the governor's executive orders. The next factor is cleaning or disinfecting protocols. So would that have an impact on your comfort level in sending your child back to school? Third would be the family's ability to support virtual learning at home. And, you know, different families were in different situations with that during this school year. Some parents felt very comfortable doing that. Other parents did not feel comfortable about their ability to support that learning at home. The next factor was availability of therapeutic drugs or a vaccine. So if there were a therapeutic drug or a vaccine, would that affect your comfort level in sending your child back to school? Next was the parent or the family's work schedule. Next was the family's daycare needs. And finally was the health needs of the child or the family that's living in that household. So those were the factors that we wanted people to kind of think about if they were influential in making the parent's decision about sending the child back to school. So if you look at the chart, 1 was for no influence. So that factor has no influence at all in how I feel about sending my child back to school. And that's in green, all the way to blue, very influential. I really care about this factor before I send my child back to school. So if you look at the chart, the daycare needs had the least influence on the parents that completed the survey at 70%. And then the cleaning protocols had the most influence on whether parents felt comfortable in sending their children back to school. And shortly after that, the next biggest factor was the level of restrictions in place at 43%. And that could mean that parents either felt like they really wanted children to be wearing masks and social distancing, or they were very much against it. And I know we have heard from many parents on both sides of that spectrum. And so lots of parents feel strongly about that one way or the other. Any questions about that slide before we move to the next?
Ms. McCabe, I did have one about the daycare needs slide, where, you know, folks were kind of answering that in a vacuum, right? They didn't know what our plans were. So do you think that might potentially have a different answer if folks knew that, you know, logistically, if we had to rotate kids in and out of the buildings, that they would only be in school in person 1 day a week, that might completely change their answer to the daycare needs question?
Yes, it could, and that is why it's very important that we send our next survey that we'll be sending out soon will be much more specific with specific scenarios, so that parents can give us specific feedback about what's going on in their particular circumstance. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this slide is the first slide that talks about our employees' results. For our employees, we had a 42.9% return rate, and we also had a 58.8% full-time employee return rate within that. So as we look at the employees and what they told us about their comfort level in returning to work, 49% said that they were comfortable reopening for all students. 38% said that they were comfortable reopening in a limited manner. 12% said that they prefer to continue with virtual instruction, and 0.5% said that they're considering taking leave for the fall. Okay, next.
And Ms. McCabe, in terms of the respondents for this is all employees, right? This isn't, so this is across all of our all of our groups of employees, not just teachers or?
Correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yes, this is employees on the whole. Next slide. Okay, so this is similar to the question we asked families, where we talk about the factors that are influencing their decision about coming back to work or their comfort level in coming back to work. There weren't as many factors here that we offered teachers, but the factors that they were offered were level of restrictions in place. So again, are they going to have to wear masks? Are students going to have to wear masks? Will there be social distancing? The next one is cleaning and disinfecting protocols. Next was the availability of therapeutic drugs or a vaccine. Next was daycare needs. And finally was the health needs of themselves or their family members. Again, green represents no influence at all in their comfort level, and blue represents that it's very influential in their comfort level about students coming back and them coming back. So in this chart, we see that the least influential was daycare needs at 73%, although we have heard from lots of employees that daycare indeed is an issue for them. And the most influential factor for our employees is cleaning protocols at 59%, and then the health needs of themselves and their families at 51%. Okay, next slide. So through the SGA, we were able to survey about 175 students about their comfort levels in coming back to school. In these charts, green is for uncomfortable, blue is for very comfortable. So in the first graph, we see that 40% of our students that took the survey are very comfortable returning to school. And in the second graph, we see that 29% are not comfortable being fully online, and 31% are also uncomfortable with that. So approximately 60% of our students who were surveyed are telling us that they are really not comfortable being fully and totally online in the fall with no in-person instruction. Okay, next slide. Okay, this pie chart shows our students' reopening preferences. So basically how they want to re-enter in the fall. 56% would like to return to school in the traditional manner. 38% would like to return in some kind of limited manner or using some kind of rotation method. And 7% would want to go fully online like we did in the spring. So those were the results of our initial survey. Again, like I said, we'll have specific surveys coming out soon once we have this discussion tonight and we start moving in a direction so that we can get more feedback.
Thanks, Cindy. Sometimes I lose control of the screen briefly for some reason. And I would just say for anyone who watches this or is watching, if you're looking at that now and saying, well, my goodness, I didn't understand that factor, or I would have completed that different if I had heard this conversation, that's fine. You know, we still have to plan based on some guidelines, and we'll have to form a plan around those guidelines, and lots of things will become a lot clearer to us, to you, to the public, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for folks to offer feedback as we go forward. And if you feel like now you would have completed a question differently, there is no worry at all that the plan will be wrong on that basis alone. There'll be plenty of things to discuss as we go forward, and this is a good place to get into that guidance that really is in the form of requirements in many cases. And And this really...
May I ask one more question on the survey first?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for both of you with how you clarified that new ones are coming. The things I heard from parents, mostly, some employees, they wanted a place to make a comment. Now, I know the problem with that is it's hard to then evaluate the comments. You've got the other data. And then also, like you just said, Mr. Neal, I think some of them were just confused, but this is a pretty confusing process for all of us and them. So I'm not sure what we can really do about that, but I really like the idea hearing that there's going to be more. As we can get more specific, there'll be more specific, and hopefully that makes them feel good. The other thing that I thought about that somewhat surprised me, you've got a percentage that like the virtual learning, but there were some people, I thought it'd be great, and again, you guys know me, I get surprised a lot. I thought it would be great that virtual learning is an option if you're worried about health issues. They looked at it that we're now denying their student the opportunities that others are getting. So I'm not sure how that moves forward, and what this data was neat, but it's also confusing, you know.
All right, I'll just jump in for a second, Mr. Carroll. I appreciate that point. We recognize, particularly the scale used in the responses, that's left to interpretation. And so, you know, I had responded to some folks. Again, as Ms. McCabe said, we're just trying to get some initial thinking, but we also want to make sure that we're providing clarity on things. And as you said, we're not quite at a place where it's easy to clarify everything. But we are going to do another survey. We are going to have an open-ended response section. We fully anticipate that we will have thousands of open-ended responses, and it'll probably run the gamut, but that's also good data and good information. And so we fully recognize, I want to make sure I go on record here to say, we recognize the challenges of some of that interpretation. You could look at some of these different ways. Certainly the first couple of questions that Ms. McCabe outlined, it just gave a choice. There's little interpretation there. But in terms of the impactfulness, I can certainly see. So this won't be the only opportunity, and we're not basing all our decisions on just one set of data in one point in time.
I just have a question. When we put out future surveys, is there any way that we could make it more readily available to more students? Because we did have more than 100 responses from the students, but I don't think it's completely representative of the more than 25,000 students we have.
Yeah, that's accurate, Devanshi. This is Jason. And so what we did is we made an attempt, considering that we weren't in school. Mr. Alasakis went ahead and sent it out to our student leaders. And so we were able to receive about 100, I think 59 responses. That's clearly not completely, a representative response of our student population. It was more from our student leaders. That is something certainly that we can go ahead and look at, but we just wanted to get a brief check-in, if you will, with some of our student leaders as soon as we could before we were able to come to tonight's meeting. But that's a great point, yes.
Is there a way when you do this survey again, you can break it down as far as masks, some masks, no masks, or, social distancing, some, whether it's the A day or B day? I mean, I think that was something I was hearing a lot from parents too. Like, there was no way to, understand, that they wanted to see an option. Like, they would have rather had to said, limited mask use or no mask use. Like, I think that kind of needs to possibly be in the next survey.
Yeah, we agree. We definitely agree with that. In this survey, they were only able to tell us what was influencing their comfort level, but in the next survey, we want to know how they feel about that particular factor. Do they agree with it? Do they disagree with it? Are they somewhere in between?
Okay.
And I think at some point, soon, because we have to, based on the timeline, to approve and post per the state. We'll have a draft plan, which won't be the final plan. Will certainly be subject to change, but in addition to any survey, it I think gets a little easier for folks, because it'll be, here's a draft plan. What do you like or not like about it? So they can get very specific in the things that you just brought up. Ms. Battaglia are great examples, because they would very much be spelled out in every draft of a plan as it unfolds. And there are things, those are all things that are going out or have gone out already to the identified stakeholder groups as well. And we'll always look to try to expand those stakeholder groups. And that's a great lead-in to the rest of this, because that was just the warm-up, and now we're really going to get into the meat of things. And so this slide talks about required state guidance, and highlights some of those things. And I think Dr. Lockard touched a little bit on these things in his opening remarks. It might be a good time to pause and restate them. We have to have a plan. We're required to do that. We would all love for I think I could speak for everyone, we would all love for the pandemic to be over and we could just have school. And if we can do that, we certainly will, in a heartbeat, do that. And most of us who've been at this for some time have always thought, there's enough work to do every summer just to get ready for the ordinary school year, the one we've always had, what I like to now refer to as before. So really, in some ways, what we're talking about, kind of the in-between, is not literally from scratch, but in many ways it's almost like planning for a different school year, as well as trying to get ready in the event that you have normal school year. The state's Board of Ed met yesterday, and State Superintendent Dr. Karen Salmon gave the state board members a briefing on Maryland's recovery plan, and that's referenced here, Maryland Together. And one of the things that appeared to me as someone watching it that was noted was, if the governor moves the state through his roadmap plan into phase 3, then that in general would mean, as a whole, schools could resume for the fall. And there's probably a lot of twists and turns to that. That doesn't mean that there wouldn't necessarily be any restrictions at all, or any masks, or anything in place. But that seemed to be what I took away, at least.
Yeah.
But also, more importantly, that.
Sorry, yeah, you're absolutely right. The language, and I that board presentation, state board presentation, was just yesterday afternoon, and I did forward on to the board what was presented there, and in their decision-making matrix that they include in their presentation to the state board. You're absolutely right. I just want to clarify that right out of the document here, when the state is in stage 3, in-person school activities may fully resume and schools can begin normal operations. So I just want to validate. Yeah. Now there might be, and there's always room for, local decision-making within these stages, in terms of if some county doesn't feel like they're ready to resume fully in stage 3, and I certainly think they'd be working with their local officials on some of those decisions, just like we've kind of seen with the phases now. Some counties are moving to those quicker than others, or starting them sooner than others. But we can all hope that we can get to stage 3, but we're here because we have to have plans in case we're not. Sorry for interrupting you there, John, but I just wanted to reference that.
You made my points better than I could, and that second half of your point, Dr. Lockard, is where I'd like to go next. Each county will have some flexibility depending on what's going on in that county, whether it's at the beginning of the school year or maybe some other point in the school year. So congratulations, Mr. Singer. Your job remains a really difficult one. But I wanted to bring that up to say that seemed to be what was said yesterday, or what was also displayed, that Dr. Lockard just quoted. And we hope that would be the case, because quite frankly, that's something we're more accustomed to, and people like normal, and so do we. But for the folks who would just say, well, then don't worry about all of this stuff that you're about to talk about or having this plan. It's important to understand that we still must have a plan, not only because the people who have authority over us say we must, but because we need to understand what all these protocols would be if something happened locally in Carroll that maybe in the middle of a year, even if it's just at a single school, if there was a certain level of exposure or something like that, then we might have to revert to kind of a more of a phase 2, so to speak, outlook in a certain place. I think it's still important that we have the plan, not only because it's required, but because it's a lot of work and it's a lot to try to process and a lot to try to understand for all of us. But having that in place probably might serve us well at some point, even if it's for a limited few days at a certain school. And, we wanted to throw that out that, even if you're feeling as strongly that we just need to be open, we hope we can be open too. But there's a lot of reasons why we think we still must have this plan, and those are some of them.
And John, I think that's a good point to make. I mean, if we end up with some sort of hybrid model, which I think might be a possibility, and that's something that's good for us to be planning for and might be something that we want to end up doing long term anyway. So it's good to be developing those plans now. But I'll ask this question of you, but maybe it's a better question for Ed Singer. The fact that if we were to move to phase 3 as a state would allow schools to open up fully with no restrictions, are there very specific statistics that have been outlined by the state, like statistics that need to materialize in order for us to move to phase 3, just so that we know, if we're kind of approaching those indicative statistics or not, as time passes?
I'll speak a little bit and see if Ed wants to speak up, because he certainly would. Everything I would say would be my thought and not necessarily 100% accurate. There are plenty of statistics that the governor highlights daily almost, but certainly every time he speaks, things about the volume of the percentage of total population who've been tested, the positivity rate of those tests, and then certainly hospitalization rates in particular. ICU beds and acute treatment beds. But Ed, it's up to you if you're at a point where you wanted to chime in more specifically.
Well, I can. It's hard for me to say, because the governor's roadmap that he had laid out with the 3 stages, he hadn't exactly followed that completely. And the one thing that I think is really lacking for phase 3. That he has in the roadmap, and I'm not sure whether he's going to stick to that or whether he's going to go with something different. But the one thing that he has in there to go to phase 3 is to have a vaccine available. And if we have to have a vaccine available, we're not going to see that until sometime next year. So I really, it's really beyond me to know what direction the governor is going to go in saying that we can move to phase 3. Now, I do expect over the next, and I just think with reopening that it's almost inherent that we're going to see a little bit of a bump in some of the number of cases, and we've seen a little bit of that at the Carroll County Health Department on Monday and Tuesday, with the number of cases being up a little bit from what it was last week, and there's going to be some kind of a bump, whether that's going to be a 2 or 3 or 4 week bump or longer than that. I can't really tell you how long that's going to happen, but it's almost inherent when you reopen things and you have more people exposed to each other and you have larger groups of people gathering, that we're going to see a little bit of a bump in number of cases and some of the issues we're going to see. And maybe, hopefully, we won't see as many hospitalizations and we won't see as many deaths, because it's kind of gone through the nursing home community already at this point. And in the general population, I think there's a lot less risk for people having as serious complications, but there are those outliers where you just can't explain why, an 18-year-old or a 25-year-old or a 50-year-old with no underlying health conditions suddenly has a bad outcome from this disease. So that was one that really strikes me. It just seems to be so random with some people that they have very poor outcomes. Anyway, I guess just back to the whole thing is, I really don't know where the governor is on what that line in the sand is going to be on phase 3. So I think you all need to be prepared to plan on reopening with phase 2 at this point. And, you know, if it's better, then it's a little easier to loosen things up than if the expectation is you're going to be going into the school year with phase 2, and then all of a sudden, you know, we can do phase 3. That makes it easier to go back to normal than if you plan on phase 3 and then all of a sudden we're stuck with phase 2. So I kind of think that's the way you guys need to be taking a look at this, because, you know, the governor's not really been giving us any hint as to what's coming next. And while the numbers in Maryland are moving in the right direction, if you do take a look at that statewide plan that the governor put out there, the one thing that's in there that really strikes me is us not being able to meet any time before this fall is a vaccine being available. So I don't know how we get there, and it could be that the governor just says, well, that's not important to me and the numbers are good and we're going to go ahead and move to phase 3. So I can't say that won't happen, but I just think you guys need to be planning with the expectation that we're going to be in phase 2 at least for another 6 or 8 months.
Yeah. Oh, well said, Ed. And quite frankly, Ed did my next slide for me, so I'll skip ahead. The only other thing I'd say about this slide is when Ms. Gaddis sends out this presentation for a public feedback email, and certainly in our draft plan, all of these items and the sub-items under them will be hyperlinked, and people will be able to link right to not only the governor's roadmap, but his executive orders and the interpretive guidance. And then in MSDE's plan, there's 13 very specific components that each local school system is required to include in the plan. So, you know, also for anybody who might say, well, this is just crazy or too much, or just do what you think is best. It's not that simple either. We have to understand these requirements of us and try to follow them as best we can. And so I'd encourage people to take a look at them so that they can understand we're not sort of, you know, just trying to make it harder or come up with things that are more confusing. Some of it is very, very confusing, and I wasn't really kidding when I said Ed kind of did my lead-in for this slide. In some ways, we're kind of planning to a moving target, and that comes in different ways. That's not meant to be a derogatory comment about the state or anyone at the state level, and certainly not for me and Dr. Salmon, who I've known for a long time and respect deeply. But they're dealing with a pandemic, and so evolving guidance comes in a couple of different ways. Things change for them. They have press conferences, and as you're planning, you find out, well, that thing just changed. And there's a couple of examples of that, and we'll start to get deep on these things over these next several slides. All of that really matters, and sometimes the guidance is a little contradictory as well as evolving, because different things are referenced throughout that plan in different ways. And for the sake of just a couple of quick examples, because they will inform what's coming up in the next slides, each time the state refers to disinfecting a part of a school or a bus in the plan, it's usually defined differently. It's defined in a place as at least once a day, or in a different place as routine, or in a different place as frequent, and so forth and so on. And all of it relies on the CDC guidance. So in that state plan, you'll find hyperlinks to various guidance documents from the CDC, and there's very specific things there. So at the end of the day, if it's not a definition, sort of disinfect means XYZ, we have to figure out what we think is best and figure out what we think we can support with the resources we have in terms of not so much supplies, because we'll do our best to get supplies, but in terms of the staff we have. And then we have to send that to Mr. Singer ultimately and say, is this okay by you? And in various ways that forms our plan. And another place where state guidance sometimes evolves, and it sounds really good at sort of the soundbite level, is when they come out and say, well, the number of folks in a gathering has increased. It's no longer 10, it's 15. That's one of the things Dr. Salmon, I think, did say once relative to daycare rooms. That's great to hear that. And if it were 25, it would be even better. And for sort of outside events or events that can be held where there's unlimited space to distance people, that number matters a lot. But for a classroom or a bus, which is a set amount of size, the classroom is only this big, changing that number but not changing the CDC requirement of 6 feet apart.
Yeah, Jonathan, can I chime in here just
Sure.
Just a bit? My thought is I looked at this whole thing, and Dr. Lockhart sent me this thing today, and I started looking over. I was like, 80-some pages? Holy smoke. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But I started looking through there and started seeing some of the things they were talking about, one student to a seat and 13 kids on a bus, and I just don't see that as being practical at all. And somebody had asked me early on about taking temperatures as kids get on the bus. I don't see that as being really practical either. You know, the thing that I would highly encourage, regardless of what we do with getting kids on and off the bus and how many kids we decide to have on the bus, and I think that's up to you guys, and we'll consult with you on that as you go through it. But the most important thing is, you know, it's kind of something I've gotten the habit with my kids and my wife and I. Whenever we come home now, and you've been out to Walmart, or you've been out someplace where you might possibly be exposed, and you might be touching surfaces where somebody who might have the virus has been. I think you just need to have every one of those kids, as they come through the school building in the morning, go in the bathroom and wash their hands. I just, as a public health person, I'm telling you, regardless of what we do on the bus, there's only going to be so much we can do to protect the kids from each other, and the bus ride's not, you know, it's a limited amount of time, and yeah, we want to do everything we can to limit the potential spread, but I think the most important thing you all as a school system might be able to do is get those kids to rotate through the restrooms as they come in the morning and make sure everybody goes in and washes their hands. So I'm gonna hit you with that.
And we appreciate that feedback, and as we get closer to, you know, a plan of our own, and you take a look at it, any flexibility that you're able to provide with your authority at the local level, Ed, will help us in terms of what we can provide. I will say for the board members tonight, so much of what we're about to go through is not always addressing the strictest interpretation of those differences that might appear throughout the guidance, because in some cases we simply can't. Cleaning every time somebody touches a door handle, we're not going to be able to pull that off unless we hire some more people. Buses, we would never get everybody to school if it's 8 people on a bus. The numbers Ed referred to in the state plan are from a Montgomery County analysis of a larger bus than the size buses we use in Carroll. But in some cases, what we're about to go through, and I'll turn this over to Cindy, we have still been relying on that 6-foot guidance. Once you get in the building, everybody has to be spaced 6 foot apart, and then that has a tremendous impact on what you can pull off or what you can. And I'm going to stop and let Cindy and then Jason and Mike talk about that.
Yeah, John, I just want to reiterate there before we continue to move forward. And Ed, I appreciate you chiming in there. Yeah, logistically, there are a lot of challenges associated with everything we're talking about. We obviously want to do things that we're required to do, have to do in the safest manner we can. The 6-foot component that John's talking about is you know, that's the difference between, you know, 1 day a week and 2 days a week in terms of being able to see students in a limited capacity. Just because when you look at the square footage of a classroom, it's just like a bus. We'd have to do 5 bus runs for the standard 1 to meet that requirement. I'm curious about your take on the 6-foot restriction and how that plays into our planning.
So, Dr. Lockhart, I was just thinking, you know, personally, I've been talking with McDaniel College and with Carroll Community College about some of their plans, and I don't know that it's going to be possible in all situations to have that 6-foot social distancing in every setting. I think we want to try to keep kids as distant as we can as much as possible. But I think what would be helpful, and just thinking about this and how I've talked to the two colleges about this, anything we can do to, whether it's assigning kids a seat on the bus, so if we do have a kid that gets sick, the health department's doing a lot of contact tracing, and you know, if you get a person that's sick, then we've got to quarantine the people who have been exposed to them for a long period of time for 14 days. And if we can limit the number of people who are exposed to somebody who becomes sick, then I think that's going to be the most helpful to us in keeping kids in school and being able to not have a large number of absences in your school system. And I think, at least in my mind, what might be more practical rather than putting 8 kids on a bus might be that you've got maybe every other row 2 kids to a seat, and this is just off the top of my head that you have assigned seats, and if somebody gets sick, you might have 4 kids that you have to quarantine, but if you don't have assigned seats, then maybe everybody on the bus gets quarantined, because who knows who little Johnny sat next to yesterday if we're moving them all around the place. And kind of the same thing in your classrooms is the things that I've been talking to the colleges about is really trying to cohort people together so that we've got a limited number of people who are potentially because we don't know who's going to come down with COVID, and if we can limit the number of people that each individual has close contact with, it's going to limit the number of people who are going to be out of school or potentially have to be out of school because they've potentially been exposed to somebody who's sick.
Well, that's great. That's great news, Ed, because as we're looking to what we could pull off here, the 6-foot rule is really what really limited our options. Our classrooms are between 750 and 900 square feet, and if we were to keep a 6-foot distance between students, that would give us about 10 students in a classroom plus the teacher. And in that scenario, we wouldn't be able to have students back in class all that often. We would have to cut classes to like quarters and have quarters of a class come in. And so if we don't have to do the 6-foot rule, it really helps us with not only staffing, but spacing and how many days a week students will be able to come into the school.
Well, I think you're going to need to plan for that 6-foot rule, at least in the classrooms, but because I'm not sure what the state's going to require, or State Department of Education, or the governor at this point, because there's no specific guidance out there for whether or not schools are going to have to comply with social distancing requirements like they do in other places. So, I mean, it's something, I know in talking to the colleges, they thought they were actually going to be able to space their desks out or their seating arrangements out far enough that they were going to be able to make this work. But I can see in the public school system where that's not going to work, especially when you're talking about elementary and middle schools and in those situations. But I think you're going to have to plan for that, and then you're probably going to have 3 or 4 plans moving down the road and see where things ultimately wind up, because we may have some flexibility, but it may also come out from the State Department of Education that you're going to have to keep the 6-foot, and if that comes out from them and that's specifically what's required, then we may not have any flexibility on that. So you need to be thinking about it. I think we also need to be thinking about how we my main concern is that we limit exposure to as many different groups of people as we can, so that we can limit the number of people that we might have to put in quarantine or isolation if a student or two becomes sick.
Mr. Singer, you bring up a good point. And like you said, there is a difference between an elementary age and a college age student. I think psychologically, for a kindergartner telling them that they can't be close to somebody and they have to stay away, that could have some severe problems later on down the road. And that's something I constantly keep in my mind, is particularly the elementary age students, that how the constant disciplining that would have to go into effect for that. You can't do that. You have to sit. There would be literally no instruction. And that is the biggest thing that I worry about, particularly with the younger kids. You know, older kids can understand a little bit more, but with younger kids, it's so much harder to constantly tell them that they can't be near somebody.
We have the same worries about that. Having elementary students and young students try to keep a social distance, as well as trying to keep masks on them all day, if that's what we were asked to do, that would be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to try to be. I know every time you add in a different variable, it makes things even more complex. But I think that we have to think about potentially using different approaches for different age groups, right? Like, so if, you know, elementary might be treated differently than middle, than high school, and maybe even within elementary, maybe you do something different for K to 2 versus 3 to 5, right? Like, I think that we need to keep those thoughts on the table, because those are very important factors and that come into play with the younger kids. And I appreciate your comments on the buses as well, because I think, you know, one of the things that we really have to zero in on are what are our biggest bottlenecks, right? And buses are certainly one of the biggest bottlenecks if we're finding out that we can only send 12 kids per bus on a bus that's meant for 60, right? I mean, that creates huge logistical issues, and I think that we should also kind of correlate that with the responses that we got from the community. If the community was willing, we saw that 40%, I think it was, close to 40% were planning to drive their kids to school. If that's something that, you know, I think that we could ask that of our community, right, to try to help us through these times. Like, if you're capable of driving your kids to school, please do it, because that alleviates one of the big bottlenecks, right? Like, so if that helps, I think that we want to keep our eye on some things that can ease some of those bottlenecks.
Right. If I could chime in, if you're looking at any indication of what might happen with the school systems, look what happened with daycare and the preschools. They're allowed to do 15 per classroom. Are their classrooms bigger than the school system classrooms? Most of the time, they're not. And if you also look at, they're allowed 15, that's for most of the daycare, that's a maximum number they're allowed in the class anyway, because of age and a number of instructors that have to be in with certain ages. So they're basically fully open with the state. I'm not saying that's going to happen with the school system, but I would look at what has already happened with them to look what might be happening with the school system in the fall.
Right.
So why the 6-foot social distancing, as most of you say, you would have 10 people in a classroom. Obviously, the daycares aren't doing that, are they? They can't. They're allowed 15 plus 2 and 3 instructors as required by each age group. I mean, you have to look at what's already happening. I don't think it's going to be as bad as maybe what was predicted. Of course, we have to plan for that.
And good evening, everyone. This is Jason, and to support a little bit of what Cindy and John had said, to speak specifically about instruction, to Mr. Frazier's comment, if we can get to 15 kids, the environment, to Ms. McCabe's statement earlier, is going to be much more doable than if we're at 10. And when we're making our instructional plans, essentially, as everyone has said several times over this evening, we have to have 3 plans ready to go. Plan number 1 is hopefully our traditional environment, right, which essentially would be a phase or stage 3. Plan number 2, which is essentially phase number 2, what we're sitting in right now, is a hybrid environment. It is a modified attendance environment. It could be, hopefully, if we had 15 students, we could make things work fairly well. And then, obviously, if we were unfortunately falling back into phase 1, that would be a complete virtual environment. And we heard loud and clear from our community, from our employees, and from our students, that is not the ideal situation. But I also want to ensure the community and our employees and our students that the work that we're doing right now is enhancing the virtual environment that they experienced this past spring for 3 months. It is going to be a much different experience. We heard loud and clear from our community and from our students, we want to be back, yes. But if we cannot be back, we need to make sure that we have the resources so that teachers can provide synchronous instruction on a regular basis. Not just asynchronous assignments and calling it a day. It would be an opportunity for our students to be engaging with our teachers regularly. That's what's most important to everyone. So obviously that's not the option that we want to be going into in the fall. But if we are looking at a phase 2 entry, we are planning for all 3, but we are spending a significant amount of time, as we should be, on phase 2 and looking at our numbers. Within each phase, or within each plan, if you will, as John alluded to earlier, there are multiple variables to be considered. Within each phase, within each plan, we have to consider attendance. We have to consider how do we monitor engagement. We have to look at when and how do we do assessments. We have to look at our grading policy, and is it compliant to whatever environment that we're in. We have to look at what's an appropriate amount of virtual instruction on a daily basis. And to Cindy's point, if students are in daycare, when will they get this instruction? When they get home that evening, we'll have to record that. So the planning and the resources that are going to need to be availed to make this happen, whatever plan we're using, whatever stage we're in, it's going to be pretty extensive. And so that is why Dr. Lockhart had us starting this before we even got out of school this past year, to make sure we have something in place that's going to be adequate for whatever we're placed in.
Mr. Anderson, is there a way, and I know it would be a lot of work, but is there a way to potentially send a postcard to parents, how many of our kids they have, and if they say that, they want to they're going to send their kid, or they need to do virtual learning? Is there a way to potentially do that? And then as we're planning, because I think if we had some responses from parents as far as my kid needs to be in the classroom. And if you had so many from Manchester Elementary or whatever, you could actually, okay, this is how many we can do. So this school might be okay, but versus potentially another different elementary school, then something would have to be figured out. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. And in fact, there are some school districts that are having that conversation. And to Dr. Lockhart's statement earlier, that could be potentially something where we continue, as he said, to dive deeper and dig deeper into the descriptive statistics of who it is that we're reaching out to. And we begin to, I know Mr. Davis and I have had lots of conversation about identifying, and to your point, which households don't have any connectivity, right? We can narrow it all the way down to the actual student and their family to get that type of insight. Now, how beneficial is that going to be? I think fairly beneficial, right, when we're looking at planning, but ultimately we're still going to have that all 3 environments available. And quite honestly, even if we were to get to a certain phase or stage, there are going to be families out there, to your point, Ms. Pataglia, that aren't comfortable in coming. And so even though we may be in a stage 2, we still have to provide a virtual environment for those families, as we should ethically, and it's our professional responsibility to do so. And that strain then falls, the burden then falls, unfortunately, on students. It falls on our teaching staff to be able to accommodate not only face-to-face but virtual instruction at the same time. I mean, it's a big lift.
Jason, if I might jump in to your question, Ms. Pataglia, we actually talked about this a couple of weeks ago. It's almost like a quote-unquote registration, right? So at some point in time, we say, all right, if you're already a student in Carroll County Public Schools or you've registered for kindergarten, now we want you to take that registration just a little further. Who is wanting to come, back into our schools on whatever the, basis might be? Who wants virtual learning? Who's going to ride the bus? So we did a broad survey. We're going to do another one, but then we'd start to hone right down into exactly what the numbers are by hearing from everybody, and we're still kind of thinking about that, but I think that's what you were sort of getting at there in your question.
Yeah, exactly. Because, I mean, you have parents that, you know, who are, you know, working now, they've gone back to their actual jobs, and there's no way that their job's going to let them stay home. Or you have a parent that, you know, they're willing to stay home, you know, because they already did, or their job is now shift to where they can stay home. I mean, there's going to be, you know, different variances, and I think that's something we definitely need to screenshot at some point. Obviously, I mean, when we move forward, you know, virtual learning wise and everything, you know, whether they are home, they are going to have to stick to like a class schedule. You know, like attendance, you would have to check, you know, get online.
There's no doubt. I mean, we were talking about the youngest learners earlier, and Ms. McCabe was making the point of, you know, how do they keep a mask on all day? Okay, let's say they are home and mom and dad are working and they find themselves in daycare during the day. When will they be getting their lessons? You know, and so that's something that we have to take into consideration as well. There's a lot of moving parts to it, but to your point, if we can set up some sort of type of extended registration to have more insight on who is planning on coming, who is not. Yeah. But we always have to have a virtual. Right now, we always have to have a virtual environment.
There's something else really important that I want to throw in here at this point that I want you all to keep in mind as you're considering what your plans are, and that is, you know, this disease is circulating in the environment out there right now, and we're having people get sick, whether it's a limited number or we see more or less come the fall. What's going to become somewhat problematic for you all to think about is people who have had close contact with somebody who actually tests positive for COVID or is suspected of having COVID are going to be expected to quarantine, and that may mean that you know, if there are a number of people within the same classroom who have had close contact with somebody who's positive for COVID-19, you might be quarantining the teacher, you might be quarantining the entire classroom for 14 days, and while those kids aren't necessarily sick, they're at risk of becoming infectious to other students, and we would require them, and we're doing this with people in the workplace right now, with people who are out in the general community, that if you've been exposed to COVID-19, we're requiring you to stay home. And you're going to have the same issue with students, and if they've been exposed to a kid who is sick with COVID-19, they're going to be required to stay home for 14 days. So it's something you're going to be needing to be thinking about, that if you have essentially, you know, a classroom full of students who have been exposed to somebody who's sick, they're going to be, while they might not be sick and they might be capable of learning, you know, the incubation period is 14 days, and that's how long they're going to be expected to be at home so they don't make other people sick. So it's an important consideration for you all as a board and as a school system to think about what you're going to do with those kids who might not be able to come to school even though they're not sick, and they might be able to learn, but they're not going to be able to come to school because they might make other kids sick.
Right, and you're right, Mr. Singer, and that's exactly why no matter what phase we're in, this fall we will have a virtual option for families, whether that's the situation or if there's folks that just aren't ready yet.
You know, and as Mr. Singer was talking, you know, that just reminded me as well as, you know, not only would it be the children in that class who would be affected, who would have to be quarantined, but if there are siblings, and then the siblings, classmates, I mean, this thing can just sort of snowball.
Yeah.
As far as who we would actually have to have quarantined.
Yeah, and Dr. Dorsey, even further, as we look into the high school with lots of transitions between classrooms.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really hard to get your head around it, because once that happens, then we have to, you know, be as responsive as we can immediately. And if we have kids, I know we want kids to be sitting in assigned seats, but if they're transitioning from classes so they can take their electives and to stay on their pathways, then they're going to have to go to different rooms. They may sit in the same chair when they go to different rooms, but someone else just sat in there, and perhaps 3 other people sat in there that day.
Right. And Dr. Dorsey, to that same point, the point Mr. Singer made, the MSDE guidance in their plan, at least for the current draft, is if there is an exposure, then everything Mr. Singer just just explained happens. The health department officials would do contact tracing to find out exactly who's been exposed, which students, which employees, and then those people ultimately will probably be quarantined for 14 days. But as a whole, if the way at least I'm reading the MSDE plan, guidance in their plan, is that that school where an exposure occurs would be closed for 2 days. So for 24 hours, they're saying we should vacate the building and let the building set, and then you come back in for the second day and do the cleaning and disinfecting the whole building, and then you would return the school to operation on the third day for the folks who aren't in quarantine. So even just in those examples, you'd have probably a few times during the school year where there'd have to be a virtual option already there for, for that school or those two schools if there's a sibling, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of reasons why we know we're having to sort of double plan here and trying to figure out how we'll use our employees and their resources to make that happen.
I'm probably getting ahead of myself here because I think you have this further down your agenda, but when we get to talking about sports programs and things like that, we could wind up with a whole football team or a whole soccer team or whatever quarantined, and you're talking, I don't know how big your football teams are now, but you could be talking 40 or 50 kids, and they're not going to be coming to school, and they're certainly not going to be competing if one of their teammates comes down with COVID and they've potentially been in close contact as a sports team. So I'm certainly not discouraging you from having sports, but you just need to realize the impact that the close contact among teammates can have as far as the number of kids that you may have that are going to be out of school.
And you guys have talked a couple times about buses, and again, sports teams, obviously, for away games, they're on a bus. And Mr. Neal, you were on some of the MABE meeting Monday, I'm not sure how much.
Yes,
John down there seems to be in good touch with a lot of things.
Yep.
He mentioned during the meeting he expects some loosening up on the buses. Now, he didn't say about loosening up on other stuff, but he says, I think in pretty soon future we're going to hear some loosening up on the buses. And then one thing I'm curious about, like for instance now, you have to transport every kid, which makes it even harder. A bus with 15 people might have 8 on it. Is there any talk about waiving some of their requirements if you do a registration where people say, yeah, I'm driving to school, that's the way it is?
Well, we are, in fact, Mr. Kyler, I'm going to skip ahead and I'll say something and then Mr. Hardesty can fill in. Try to touch on a few things you said. I was there for much of that meeting. I couldn't stay till the very end. I'd agree with Mr. Williams' assessment from MABE. One of the places in the MSDE guidance where there's already the hint of flexibility is on buses. So they do understand that you can't take the strictest view of every public health restriction and logistically get kids to school. And so they sort of, if you look at that plan carefully, they sort of say, here's what the CDC guidelines would be, and that would be the ideal. And using I think it's a 77 passenger bus, Mike, in Montgomery, that would limit that bus to just this number of kids. I think we use like a 64 passenger bus in Carroll, so even fewer. But then they kind of say, but realistically, we know that can't happen, so you should come up with a plan that's careful and reasonable. And they say something like, you could sit siblings together, and I think we would do that, and that you could maybe have 1 kid per seat with a mask, and that's probably a slight variation of what Mr. Singer said earlier of 2 kids per seat with a mask with a seat in between them. We were thinking more like 1 child per seat wearing a mask, and so there's already the hint of some flexibility. I think they realize that we can't get kids in the school to teach it if we're too restrictive on the buses. Disinfecting between every run as opposed to the morning run and the afternoon run. I think, Mike, if you're there, you might want to comment on that. That gets into changing school times because of the amount of time that would be there. And I don't know, Mike, if you're prepared. I think for the sake of discussion, I know you and I have had some discussions. You might want to talk about how I'll just speak for me, and then you as an expert can clarify. Mr. Kyler, I don't think we can design special bus routes. I just feel like we're going to have to run our bus routes, and whichever kids are scheduled that day get on that day, because Mike and his team can't plan 5 bus routes a week. It just isn't. It's not feasible. It might be the ideal, but it's not feasible. Mike, I'm not sure if you're there and you want to fix everything I said or any of it, but feel free.
Before Mike speaks, I'd like to say something. This is Marcia. I don't know, but we must think about common sense. When you think about students getting on buses, I know my 2 granddaughters rode the bus together. So why couldn't then have family members sit 2 in a seat? We've got to go back to common sense. Yes, kindergartners will herd together. High schoolers will sit at lunch and not even talk to each other because they're on their phones texting to each other. So somewhere in the middle, there has to be common sense and guidelines that we can open these schools and meet our students' needs. And when I think of the school buses, and they are the first people that are going to see these children, again, common sense. You know, you can put your family members together and then have others sit in individual seats. And we do have a lot of siblings that go to the same school. So I'm not going to say a whole lot this evening, but let's don't forget common sense and be positive about this, because this could really get ugly. And there you go, Mr. Hardesty.
Thank you, Ms. Herbert, and you're exactly right. I mean, I'm part of a statewide committee that's trying to develop kind of uniform standards that we could all look to that are reasonable and make sense. And one of the models that we're looking at is 1 child per seat, kind of staggered those so that no child is sitting directly behind another child or directly across the aisle from another child. The seat behind the driver would be left vacant to protect the driver. All the children would be required to wear face masks unless there's some disability or some other condition that would prevent them from wearing a face mask. As far as the cleaning and disinfecting, as John mentioned, it would be great if we had the time to do that, if drivers had the time to do that after every single run. But our runs are you know, we do the first tier and we're right on the second tier. We might have a small layover between the first and second or the second and third, but generally speaking, most of our buses are running one school to the next to the next. And so our recommendation would be to clean and disinfect after the morning run and then after the afternoon run, so the next morning the buses are fresh again. So we do recognize, you know, 6-foot social distancing on a school bus would mean 8 to 9 students on our 64-passenger bus. Totally unrealistic, not doable. The big thing for us, as Mr. O'Neill also mentioned, is scheduling. And our buses will be ready to run on a normal schedule September 8th. We're prepared to do that. But the instructional models that could be decided upon are greatly going to impact our ability to provide effective transportation the first day of school. So time's running short if we're going to be doing something different in terms of our routing than what we already planned to do.
And not to change the subject, Mr. Hardesty, but I want to thank you and Sheriff DeWeese for having a wonderful patrol bus meeting today at the Ag Center. That was excellent.
Thank you.
And I think you just made an excellent comment about realistic on the bus, and I'm sure you guys have beat it to death, but there's got to be a dozen things that if we're held to, we just can't go back to school. If we're held to 8 on a bus, we can't go back to school.
Right.
You know, and again, and Mr. Singer is going to come over and smack me, and he's big enough to do it. If the masks are so good, then if somebody's sick on a bus, we shouldn't have to quarantine everybody else because they had the mask on. And I understand, Mr. Singer, I'm oversimplifying this stuff, but it just seems like with so many things with this, we're belts and suspenders. And my big worry is we're going to be virtual learning in September because we can't afford all the belts and all the suspenders on top of each other. And I know, you know, again, you guys on staff, you at the health department, you're following the guidelines set down by the state. And I'm sure when you're on these statewide committees, you're all voicing your opinions on, we just can't do this. It's not going to work. Like Mr. Singer said about the buses, that's got to bend, or I don't see us going back to school.
So, back to what you were saying, Mr. Kyler, again, back to what I said early on in the meeting, I think the most important thing to do, because I think CDC is finding less and less of a concern that this is, that people are getting this from surfaces and things of that nature. And, you know, the kids, and having a seating chart on the bus is going to be important, because it may be that we've got to quarantine the 4 kids in the front of the bus, and we don't have to quarantine the entire bus. So I think that whole thing of the assigned seats and knowing where kids are sitting and who they're closely exposed to, our definition of a close contact is within 6 feet of somebody for a 15-minute period. So those kids that just happen to pass each other on the bus to go to the back of the bus, it's not a big deal. You know, but if we got 4 kids that are within 6 feet of each other in the front of the bus, maybe those 4 kids are the ones that have to get quarantined if little Johnny gets COVID. And that's, you know, that's the thing we need to think about. And the other important thing that I mentioned earlier is just when the kids get off the bus, make sure they wash their hands, because, you know, you're not going to stop them from touching their face and touching their mouth and all that kind of thing. But if the place where they've most likely been exposed to potentially being exposed to the virus is on the bus, because we've got tight quarters there, getting them wash their hands when they first come to school is just something good to be in the habit of, and we'll have less risk of exposure that way. So, you know, I get it that it's not practical to sanitize things as often as people would like, and I see that was the big thing that everybody was liking in the survey, was processes for sanitizing everything. But you just, I mean, there's only so much you can do. There's only so much time in the day and only so many employees that you can employ to do the sanitizing. So the most practical thing comes back to just good personal hygiene, and it is hard with kindergartners, but if we get them to come in the school building and get them to walk through the bathroom and get them all to wash their hands, I think that's going to go a long way in helping with some of this. And ultimately, you know, if there are guidelines set down from MSDE or from the state that we have to follow, we're going to have to follow them. But I'd be most comfortable with making sure that we're doing what we can to limit exposure and keep them limited to the number of people that they're potentially interacting with while they're on the bus, and having them wash their hands. And you did mention the face coverings, and I do think those are important, and I know it's going to be a real pain in the rear, but I think it's a small price to pay for us to be able to operate a little bit more normally. Just the droplet spread, some of the studies on how droplet spread is limited by wearing face coverings is really important. And I know it's going to be tough with the elementary school kids, but if we could get at least the middle school and the high school kids wearing face coverings, I think that's really important. And I think it'll help go a long way in us not having outbreaks in our schools.
Mr. Singer,
I like the comments about the mask with older kids. If that's possible, that would be so great. And I like the common sense stuff for the buses. I love that you brought up surfaces, and I'm hoping CDC keeps learning more about surfaces, because again, it's like Mr. Hardesty just said, the buses, that's a big deal, how often you have to clean them. It's a big cost. And then I told somebody the other day, if surfaces aren't bad, you know, I said, think about the cost of cleaning 44 buildings all the time if it's not needed all the time, you know. And the hand washing, that's super for kindergarten on, because you're teaching them a skill they should learn for life.
Mr. Singer, I have a question, well, actually 2 questions. So my first question is, currently, what is the mask regulations? Is it recommended or required? And then my second question would be, do you think it potentially would be good for, like, if the students are in the class, they can remove their mask, kind of like when we go to restaurants now. You can, once you sit down, you can remove your mask, but when you're walking around, if they're transferring to classes, that's when they would require the face mask.
So let's start with your first one, and it's very complicated, because you got to look in the governor's executive orders and the Secretary of Health's orders and to look and see where face masks are required. Right now, it's required in all retail establishments, it's required in food service establishments, and it's required in daycares and I think pools, and there's some other places that it's required. So I don't think there's anything specific to school settings right now, but I would imagine that there's going to be something it's either going to be, yes, it's required, or no, it's not required by the time you all go back to school. And I would be leaning to think that between the Secretary of Health and the State Department of Education, given the information that's out there, that they're probably going to make it mandatory on at least certain ages. And I just, just given the amount of spread that you can limit from droplets based on wearing a face covering, I get it. It's not comfortable. I don't like it. I wear the thing in my office, and it's not anything that anybody likes. But it's probably, I look at it as being the least intrusive thing we can do to be able to get back to our lives being a little bit more normal than what they are right now.
And Ed and Ms. Battaglia, when you look at the MSDE plan for us, Ed's right that there's no executive order or order from MDH specific to schools, but when you delve into the MSDE plan, what it appears to us that they're saying is kids on buses, and like Mr. Kyler said, they recognize there's got to be some reasonableness on buses. So kids on buses, one to a seat or whatever, a mask for that portion of their day. And then masks in schools for when you're in motion, but not necessarily socially distanced. So once you settle into that, and again, all of this assumes that 6-foot rule still, which is the major, I think Ms. Savigny used the term bottleneck, and maybe that doesn't apply here, but the major restricting factor, not to say that it's not important, but once you get to the place where you're 6 feet apart, then you don't necessarily have to have the mask on during during that class period, but when you're walking down the hallways. And again, there's supposed to be guidelines and distancing happening when people transition. But in those scenarios, you put the mask back on. When you get to the class and you're distanced, again, you wouldn't have to wear the mask for that period of time. That's kind of how we're seeing what MSDE is saying in the plan that they've given to us. One last point on buses, unless you all have more thoughts or questions, because I think this is our thinking initially, and I think it sort of aligns with what Mr. Singer's been saying. It's perhaps looking at it slightly differently, but he's mentioned assigned seats a couple of times. One of the things that MSDE is suggesting that I think Mike is at least thinking about is not as much this is your seat and that's my seat, but as kids come on the bus, they just go to the last seat and then the next to the last seat until you fill up the bus that way, so there's not a lot of passing back and forth. And then when you come home in the afternoon, maybe the same thing, and that's a little harder to do because you can't plan out where every student lives. But to one of the points Mr. Singer made about exposure, meaning sort of 3 foot or whatever the guideline was at contact for a period of time, just passing, getting on and off the bus probably wouldn't necessarily qualify for exposure that would render you in quarantine later. So I think that's kind of what we're thinking at first, Mike, is fill the bus from the rear.
Jonathan, the one concern I have about that and not having the assigned seats is if we have to get into contact tracing, asking elementary school kids who they sat next to today, if we fill the bus that way without knowing who was in which seats, then we get into potentially quarantining people unnecessarily. And if we know which seats they're in, and I know this is a hassle for you guys, but if we know which seats who sat in, then I know when we're doing contact tracing, okay, Johnny was within 6 feet of Emily and Jordan during the bus ride, and those are the 3 kids that can't come to school for the next 14 days because Johnny has tested positive for COVID. If we don't know, and we have to start asking the families, well, who did Johnny sit next to on Monday? Johnny's not going to remember. So we're going to need some help from you guys in trying to manage that, because otherwise we're going to wind up quarantining whole busfuls of kids that we don't need to quarantine.
Sure.
And that's not anything new. We've been assigning bus seats to students for quite a while now, and one of the main reasons we did it initially was just in case a bus had been involved in an accident, we need to know who was sitting where. And like you were saying, Mr. Singer, you can't always depend on the kids to remember, oh yeah, well I was here and this one was there. So over the years, I mean, I can remember when I was an administrator, we had to have bus rosters for each of our buses.
Yeah,
I think even Southwest is figuring out who's sitting in what seats on their planes these days.
The good thing, Ed, that might help on buses and buses alone is we do have internal cameras. So, we can actually pull them and help you with contact tracing pretty quickly, whether there's assigned seats or not. You can confirm the assigned seats. And I might have misspoke in the first place. I'm still not sure if that's what the initial thought was, Mike, or not. But that's something, that's obviously a great conversation. We need to work that out.
Yeah, that is something we're certainly hoping to do. As Dr. Dorsey said, bus seat charts have always been a common practice. Not a common practice. It is our practice to have a bus seat chart for every bus. And the complication here is if we went, for instance, to a 1 day a week scenario, we would have to have a different seating chart for each day of the week. But certainly as students enter the bus and are assigned seats from the back forward, we could develop a seating chart on that basis. But I think what John indicated with the cameras, that would certainly be a very effective way to identify students that are in the proximity of a student that is infected or is thought to be.
So I just have a question regarding masks. So should there be requirements about what specific kinds of masks students should wear? Because I know that there are many different kinds of masks out there and they have different levels of activity. So will there be requirements for that?
So there's guidance, Devanchi, there's guidance in the CDC. The CDC has guidance on that, and then the governor's executive order when he first required masks to be worn in public spaces, the kind of public spaces that Mr. Singer discussed earlier. There's some suggestions as to what, and it need not, a mask or I guess a facial covering. There's some suggestions as to what's effective. It's not a medical grade mask except for very specific of our employees. I think, Ed, it's like a 2-ply facial covering.
Yeah, let me just chime in on that. And the important thing for people to realize is the masks, the facial coverings that we're talking about that we're requiring people to wear in stores and retail outlets and eating establishments and things like that are not to protect the person who's wearing it. It's to protect the other people from, if somebody coughs or sneezes, it essentially catches those droplets. And there are a bunch of studies that have been done just to show how that stops the droplets that essentially would cause somebody to be infected. You're protecting that other people from the person who might potentially have COVID. So the mask does not, the facial coverings that we're talking about do nothing really to protect you from somebody who might be infected. But if we're all wearing them, it helps us protect each other from each other. Who, you never know whether I have COVID or you have COVID. There's some people that are asymptomatic that are carrying this, and if we want to try to help keep this from spreading and having a large number of absences in your school system, which would cause you a huge problem just from an attendance standpoint, we need to do what we can to keep it from spreading amongst the school population.
Okay. Board members.
John, I did just want to make one other comment that kind of ties together some of the things that everybody's been talking about. I mean, you heard Kenny make the statement of, if we can only get 8 kids on a bus, that means we can't go back to school. And, if you have to do the 6-foot spread in the classrooms, that means that we can only get 10 kids in a classroom, and that limits us to only 1 day a week. Whereas if you can go to 15 kids versus the 10, that means, now we can go 2 days a week. I think if we can really keep an eye on the bottlenecks and the issues that they cause, right? Like, okay, well, this is a factor that would cause us to push from not being able to do it at all, or this could get us to 1 day a week, and then this could get us from 1 day a week to 2 days a week. If we keep a very close eye on those factors, then we could ask for specific guidance on those issues. And I think if we could lay it out that way, that we might actually end up having a little bit more flexibility than we think we have.
That's a lovely segue, in fact, President Savigny. With your permission, I'd like to flip back one slide, or for those folks who have the paper in front of them, from where I am on the screen with transportation, if we could go back to staffing, everything you just said, this would be a discussion area for that. I think this identifies some of those so-called bottlenecks. And if Jason and Cindy want to highlight some of the teaching staff issues, those deal with the, and if the term's not correct, I'm sorry, I'm just borrowing from you because I'm not that creative, but the bottleneck of what the 6-foot rule would mean in the class setting. And then Ray could then talk a little bit for the building operations staff of depending on how you interpret routine or how often you disinfect, what that means for his staffing. I think it gets right to those points.
So as far as the six-foot rule goes, if we need to follow the 6-foot rule, then our option would be each student comes to school 1 day a week. So it would be basically 25% of a class on each day. So that if you look at a week, there would be an A, B, C, and D day each week. And if you're student A, you may come to school every Monday. If you're student B, Tuesday, et cetera, et cetera. There would also be a day built in for sanitizing, cleaning, and things like that. Virtual learning would be going on during all 5 days of the week. If the 6-foot rule were not in play, then we could go to an AB kind of week, where 50% of the class comes on day A, and the other 50% comes on day B. There would be a day for cleaning and sanitizing, and then it would be A on Thursday, B on Friday. So that 6-foot rule is what is really making the difference between a 1 day a week in person for students and a 2 day a week in person for students. The other way to do this, or to phase things in, that came out in the state's plan was a phase-in based on level, student level, with elementary students all coming back first in person, while secondary students stayed at home and participated in online instruction. The problem with that is one of staffing and space. If the 6-foot rule is still in play, then we can still only have about 10 students in a class, which would mean we would need to make use of middle schools and high schools, and we would also have to hire hundreds of extra elementary school teachers in order to have enough to serve all elementary school students at the same time in classes of 10. So those are the logistics that we're really working on. Jason, do you want to talk a little about planning for virtual instruction and in person?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Cindy. And that gives everyone a quick overview of our limitations. Really what it comes down to is that we have to continue to look at all 3 plans. We know that right now, if we were to return right now, we would have students at least 1 day a week. As a reminder, that's if we only had them in 1 day a week, that means they're receiving essentially 75% of their instructional time or more virtually, with the 1 day of being on site, which would be a small group, obviously spread out. And so with that said, I want to go back to the lift that will have to take place with our teachers then to not only deliver the content and the curriculum to the students that are in the classroom on that day, but also figuring out a way when, how, that we would deliver virtual instruction to the other 20 plus 30 students that are actually at home receiving instruction virtually that day. And so when does that take place? And so we're bouncing ideas around. We're talking to different people. There's discussions about having a block of the time during the day or during the mod or during the course or during the class that a certain percentage of time the teacher is asking the students that are there to work independently while they engage with kids online for a short period of time. That's not the most ideal situation either. And to Cindy's point, if we can get the kids in at least one day a week, if we are limited to a 6-foot type of buffer, then there would be one day where everyone would be getting the virtual instruction with the teacher included, providing it virtually. There are lots and lots of variables, again, to be looked at. I know that we're going to be getting into another slide, and I'll give you just a little heads up and a little preface to that. When we look at the current schedules that our high school students walked away with getting ready for next year, that's going to have a huge impact on schedules. It's going to have, if we are looking at a cohort of A days, B days, essentially you're talking about having face-to-face on-site instruction only 2 days a week. The other 3 days will be virtual. There's a lot of districts that are looking at that and looking to put that in place. And then there's always, again, the option of students and families wanting to be completely virtual. What that then does is it has huge ramifications and implications, rather, for schedules at the high school. I'll give you an example. If you're working as a principal of a high school and you have 300 students in your sophomore class and they all have to take English 10, you're looking at 10 sections of just English 10. So you're going to need to have teachers to teach just English 10 sections, and that's going to be on an A-day, B-day schedule, which we're familiar with. But then, most importantly, if that is Mod 1, where now, and Cindy and I are both in that class, but I'm heading now to World Languages, and she's heading over to Geometry, what does that mod look like? Can we keep that mod to only 10 kids? So you can see, again, and we're working with Eric, and we're working with other high school principals and getting their insights on is this possible? But I have a feeling that if we are in this situation, it's really going to fall on the law of unintended consequences. We're going to have to, go through very manually with students to make sure that we are not surpassing that ratio in each class. And so you can see the complexity of this. And so that's why we want to be completely back traditionally. However, we have to have a plan for each potential phase, and it's really going to keep us, as John said earlier and Dr. Locker, we need to remain nimble and agile.
We also have to really think about the heavy lift that we're asking our teachers to do if we're asking them to both teach in person and teach virtually certain students at the same time. It's hard enough to do one or the other, but trying to do both is very difficult, and we have to also make sure that we are honoring their planning time requirements, because, as I said, this is going to take a lot of planning. It's nothing that anyone is used to doing.
Is there a way to align, the kids that are, or the parents that are saying they're not comfortable sending their kids in and want to stay fully virtual, and aligning that with, teachers that are saying they're not comfortable coming in and they want to stay virtual? Is there a way to have, like, a group that's 100% virtual because that's what they're most comfortable with, and then a group that's as much as possible in person because they're comfortable with that? Is there a way to split it that way that optimizes?
Yeah, so we've talked about that at length as well, and that's really, we have never been in that position. So, I think that once again we'll be looking at, making sure that we're taking care of all of our employees and our teachers to say, okay, well, your colleague is working virtually, but now we're asking you to come in. So I think that potentially, and John, you can speak more to that, from an HR perspective.
Well, there's that, and then the third sub-bullet on the screen, President Savigny, there are some regulatory limitations. How much that could happen would also depend on who those students just happen to be and who those teachers just happen to be, because by state law or state regulation, teachers can't teach completely out of assignment area, nor would they want to, and nor would we want them to.
Right.
But they can, more than just a couple of classes. So, you know, how much we could do with that. Certainly the employees and the unions perhaps would have some weigh in on the kinds of things Jason just mentioned. And then we'd have to also be able to see, okay, well, who are these students we've identified, and what are the certifications of the teachers who would prefer virtual, even if there was a chance of working that out. That's a big component there.
It is. It is, John.
Right, I know that you would definitely have to have the teachers with the right certifications that you're matching up with groups of kids, but you would be able to match up, let's say it's 20% of the student population that wants to stay 100% virtual. That could be, you know, there could be, though, you know, 100 kindergarten kids across, like, or you know, you wouldn't have to have them all in one elementary school, right? Like, it could be kindergarten kids that you were grouping across lots of different schools, but just one kindergarten teacher.
You're correct, Ms. Savigny. This is Steve. And the example you gave is probably one of the easier ones at the elementary level, because the certification there covers just about typically all the grades in elementary school. So it would be a little bit easier certification-wise for us to do that. The complexity, and I know you recognize this, that we get at is if you've got a kid that is learning from home and they're enrolled in, you know, French 3, that takes a specific certification and skill set from a teacher to be able to teach that course.
Yeah, and President Savigny, to your point as well, it's been made very clear to us that we are, you know, held responsible still to make sure that we are complying with ESSA and providing access and credit to a well-rounded curriculum. So every option needs to be provided to our students, no matter what. So, you know, we also have that, you know, above our heads as well, that we have to provide everything that our students are entitled to, no matter what the environment is.
One other consideration is, you know, we may have students who are learning online for portions of this coming school year and are going to school in person for periods of time during this school year. And we've heard from some teachers that it's really important that our students have some consistency at the elementary level with who their teacher is, whether they're virtual or face-to-face. So we're also trying to take that into consideration as well, that, you know, if you're staying at home or if you come to school that next week, that you're interfacing with the same teacher.
And kind of with staffing, and you brought up that consistency, which is super, especially at elementary, but, and if this is a topic for later tonight or another meeting, let me know. What about the guidance counselors, the school psychologists, all those people seeing the students that the students desperately need? That's one of the big things I've heard about spring is, you know, I wanted to see my counselor. Some of them, I've asked kids that at certain schools, they have an issue. Who do I tell? I said, who are you comfortable with? It might be the SRO. I want to talk to her tomorrow. How do they do all that? And then what about all the special needs kids and the consistency for them? And like I say, if that's later on the show, fine, I'll wait. If it's too much for tonight, I'll wait longer. But those things really, really concern me.
We can have Mr. Streaker talk a little bit about mental health and what kinds of things we are planning for the fall. Mr. Streaker?
Thanks, Mr. McCabe. Good evening, board members, Dr. Lockard. Mr. Kyler, to your point regarding mental health and the care that we're doing, We've been in contact with students and encouraging students to reach out to counselors, throughout the school closure period when we were in school. And now that we're in summer, we have professional learning opportunities for our school staff that we're running frequently just to give them, backgrounds and skills in really honing those skills into supporting students. And as we think about the reopening, we have students that we always reach out to throughout the summer, and maybe a student who needs support in seeing the school before we start, to do tours and meet with a teacher. So those are pieces that we're certainly well aware of and trying to plan for whatever that would be when it takes place. And I would say, as far as reaching out to staff, one of the pieces that we'll be doing in the August timeframe, we're working with Mr. Anderson and his professional learning teams to make sure that we have a mental health component to the professional learning we're offering for staff, both in that respect, as well as working with school directors so that we have time that when our schools come back for teachers, individual schools will be talking about their Tier 1 interventions for how they meet the needs of the students as they return. And then we've even discussed as a mental health team allocating our staff in very purposefully, like that first couple of days of school, so that we have, instead of perhaps school psychologists would usually visit their 2 to 3 schools the first day, and being at all 3, maybe we identify that they stay in one school all day, and a mental health therapist stay in their school all day, so that there's somebody there to support students as those needs emerge. So as the plans unfold for what opening looks like, we'll certainly be adapting to that, but we've got professional learning opportunities for staff, as well as thinking about reaching out to those students. Our people personnel workers are in touch with families throughout the summer traditionally, and continue to. So a lot of things are going on. The challenge, of course, is it's hard to give people information on what it looks like. When you think about the anxiety that many of our students and families are facing, it's the balance between complicating the anxiety without information, because we don't know. And what we really want to communicate is we're here to support them. And we have folks on standby throughout the summer with regard to summer learning that we're kicking off. So if students, and I would say to anyone listening this evening, please reach out to your schools, and we have people ready to respond if situations come up.
I know no one's touched on this yet, but I am concerned about the career and tech students. They lost all that on-hand education in the spring with the saw in their hand and bricks and mortar and chopping onions and baking bread and cutting hair. We have got to get those students back in there and get their hands on projects. What are we addressing this? Because they have lost so many hours of good education.
Yeah, absolutely, Ms. Herbert. I'll go ahead and start, and then I'll turn it over to Ms. McCausland to talk more explicit. But so Mr. Eccles has been working with a number of principals around the system to potentially look at alternative locations in August to bring back small groups of our students so that they can get some of their skill hours, which you're referring to. It's essential. Our biggest challenge right now is that our CTC is going to be under construction. And so that's a big challenge. So what we've looked at is identifying alternative locations where we can get some of the materials to. Some of the materials, as you're familiar, are just so large that it's very difficult to move those. We're also working with our partners in the community and actually setting up experiences for kids to go ahead and take part in those, in professional types of experiences this summer, following the appropriate guidelines. So, Angie, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Hold on, Angie, excuse me. Have we thought about increasing internships or anything to get them out?
Yes.
Out in the workforce, or somehow to get experience rather than to stay home?
Yeah, absolutely, Ms. Herbert. We actually worked with Mr. O'Mealy to go ahead and to work through that waiver to make sure it's permissible for our students to go ahead and do that during this time, and we got the green light on that. So they are starting to do that, and again, I'll let Angie talk about that specifically.
Yeah, so our career coordinators are working with CTE teachers in all the buildings to find appropriate placements for students with business partners in the community. So that's been going on for the past couple of weeks. Took a little bit of time to tweak the wording and get everything down, but that's in place, and all the career coordinators at all the high schools as well as the tech center are working on placing students.
Well, thank you, because that is so important. I mean, because they lost all of those hours of not being able to have hands-on experience, and that's what that's all about. That whole career in tech is that experience that they get. So thank you so much, because they want to go there, they want to do it, and they need that. So thank you so much.
Angie,
go ahead.
sorry. I wanted to ask Angie real quick. Do we contact the Chamber of Commerce regarding that internship possibility as well, to let them know that this is what is available, if any of the local businesses can help some of these students get some of the hours and the hands-on experience they need?
Yes, I know our career coordinators work closely with the Chamber of Commerce as well as the Office for Economic Development and even the county government. So yes, they have connections all over the county. They do a great job of drumming up business for the kids to get them in placements that are appropriate for what they're studying.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Board members, on the slide on the screen, there was one last area that obviously what goes on in the school classroom is the whole reason for all of us. But I did want to at least touch for just a few moments on operations. I think it's another sort of like transportation, another good place where we really need to talk about trying to follow rules, but also employing some common sense, as Ms. Herbert said. And I want Ray to sort of talk about some of the suggestions in the state plan, and then reasonably what we might be able to pull off with the staffing we have. And I want to take a moment, if you'll indulge me, because I've had this conversation with Mr. Kyler recently and other people. Kenny springs to mind because I remember it just happening. We've done this before. Steve certainly has, but I definitely don't take the time out to recognize this group of people as much as they deserve it. And they've been in the buildings since they've closed, keeping them safe and clean and disinfected. They've been back since a few days ago on full force in our buildings, our building operations staff. And, specifically, I made reference to a conversation with Mr. Kyler. He was pointing out to me something I do know, which is that much like a lot of our employees, all of our employees, this is a group of people who take a lot of pride in their work and how they keep our buildings well maintained and clean and safe, and they deserve a lot of credit for everything they've been doing throughout this process. And they're also a group that this plan has significant impact for, and we would like to just take a few minutes and talk about what that impact may be.
Yeah, thank you, John. You're absolutely right. Those are great comments. Actually, I thought I was going to be on when Jason used the words nimble and agile, because that's pretty much how I'm looked at throughout central office. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is a heavy topic, and I just had to. The biggest things I think.
Hey, Ray, don't quit your day job. Don't quit your day job. I don't think you have a career here. I've been told. The toughest things we're looking at, as John mentioned at the very beginning, are some of the guidance that we're getting, which is at cross purposes with other guidance and other initiatives. Also, in trying to interpret the guidance we are given, because there's throughout this evening has been a lot of talk about, I guess my interpretation might be different from Ed Singer's. Which might be different from Mr. Kyler's, which might be different from Ms. Herbert's. When someone talks about high-touch areas, defining a high-touch area, it starts out looking and sounding fairly straightforward, but it gets to a bit more complicated when you have to look at, especially a high school
with so many unique areas that could be used, perhaps, just occasionally during the week may be used. So, when we talk about high touch, just that in and of itself is can be a bit of a struggle. Also, as we're looking through high touch areas, we're also looking at hard to clean areas, hard to clean surfaces that the CDC talks about. These are areas, these are things where we have fabric or rugs or stuffed animals, things like that might get passed from student to student or used student to student. We're going to have to look seriously at those sorts of things being in the schools at all. When we look at disinfecting in general, essentially we already do that in bathrooms on a daily basis. On a weekly basis, we clean classrooms, but it's really limited to the classrooms, desks, those sorts of things. This has gone a bit further. We're also looking at offices and all other spaces. We'd be looking at mats in the gym areas, things like that. We might be mopping with disinfectant. Again, if we are looking at the interpretation as I see it, and that would be, this idea of frequently. We're at the moment landing on once per day. That lends its own areas of concern. It isn't something that we typically do, so the amount of manpower we're looking at, there might have to be supplemental forces to assist. And that's barring any situation where we might have any sort of an outbreak. Someone mentioned earlier, Mr. Singer mentioned earlier, or maybe it was John, about shutting down the school for 24 hours and then cleaning. Well, what if the custodial staff were some of the folks who were exposed, for instance? Now we have, so we're looking at things from those perspectives. How do we go about implementing this additional task while still also trying to take care of what we typically do? There may have to be managing of expectations. We might have to shift folks who would normally handle our grounds to the interior of the building to supplement those forces. So the grounds may not be quite what we're used to them being. We have to look at also, the more a building is used, the more difficult it's going to be to get cleaned in the time that we have. So you could just imagine that if right now we're focusing on the instructional day, and that instructional day might end at 4 or so, and then from 4 o'clock till 6 a.m. the next morning, we have that opportunity to clean. If buildings are being used for other purposes, that window becomes smaller and smaller. So other uses have to be also going to have to be considered in the process. So those are some of the things we're thinking about. We're trying to again, we're trying to understand some of the some of these. Trying to understand how it is that we can adapt, especially different schools. Elementaries are going to be different from high schools and so on. And again, the expectations. So that's sort of what we see. It's part of the recommendations that we've made. This is incorporated in it. Again, much of this is our assumptions based on the guidelines we're seeing. And so I'll just leave it at that and entertain questions with what folks might be seeing from what I'm, where we're going with this.
And if you're thinking of questions, board members, I'll only add that, what we're not staffed to do, unfortunately, and if you think back to some of the survey answers, that seem to be an important point. It's important to us as well, but we're not staffed at a level where we can literally have somebody patrolling a hallway with sanitizer and a wipe and, cleaning every doorknob every time it's touched or cleaning materials. It's not going to be that kind of frequency. It's going to have to be a much more common sense frequency that we're talking about here.
But I would just add to what John just said. But even at that, we're concerned about our ability to handle that from a manpower standpoint.
Right. This might become clearer when a draft is developed and some of the recommendations which are being vetted are there, that there's, these are the kind of the guts of the plan, but there's some interesting things that we have to think through here as a school system, and I'm sure that conversation will continue as we go forward. Briefly, we did want to touch on, we spent a lot of time on transportation. I did want to skip and touch on supplies, materials, and PPE, personal protective equipment is what PPE stands for. We are thinking about all these things. We can get into a lot of detail or certainly answer your questions if you want. We're not far down the road with all of these aspects, but we're looking at whether we need to modify parts of some schools. One great example of that might be certain health suites to make sure that the proper isolation areas are in play within a given school, but also space modifications. So, for instance, really high volume places in an office, maybe installing plexiglass sneeze guards or things like that. These are all the things we're thinking about. In addition to the hand washing that Ed's been talking about tonight, having enough hand sanitizer everywhere, having enough cleaning products and disinfectant. And we're talking about more than in the past because of the frequency and also some of the additional areas such as buses, masks, gloves, gowns, etc. All of these things that everyone's brought up in part, this is a big part of our thinking and our plan, and we can go into that detail if you want. I didn't know if at this point if we wanted to get into just a broader Q&A with you, but I would say one point we do want to make here is we're trying to make our best judgments on what we'll need to open the school year and get into the beginning of the school year. And there's a little bit of risk in that because the guidance continues to change. It might be a little bit different. Things might look a little different 2 months from now than they look today. But at the same time, and Dr. Lockhart has been telling me this every time he talks to me, at the same time, we can't get to the start of the school year and say our order didn't come in. So there's perhaps a little bit of risk here that we'll oversupply something, but we also know that we can't undersupply things. So there will be some things that we've already placed orders for, and we think the market's a little bit better than it was sort of at the onset of this pandemic. But we say all that to you to let you know also that there may be some procurement that happens that we'll inform you of later because of the urgency rather than having waited for another board meeting to bring it to you for approval as well. So hopefully that broader point made sense, that we're not waiting to order things we're pretty sure we're going to need and in some bulk because we know we don't have the luxury of time on some of these things.
John, I appreciate you letting everybody know of my persistence with that point, but that's a risk that I think is only advantageous to us in that I don't ever want us to get to a place where we can't do something because we don't have enough hand sanitizer or we don't have enough of whatever is required. And that's why I want to be aggressive now with getting those things. And if it sits on our shelf for a little while, I'm okay with that if it helps us, get to whatever the next phase or level or more kids to be able to come back at some point. So like I said, I think that's the risk, the appropriate risk worth taking at this point.
And I agree with that, Dr. Lockhart. I think that as just smart planning and we don't, like you said, we don't ever want to be in a position where we're like, oh, well, we could have done this if only we had X, Y, and Z, and we don't want to be in that position. So I think this is just good planning.
Are teachers permitted to use disinfectant materials in their classrooms if they wanted to?
Mr. Prokop?
Yeah, the concern with any product in the school, of course, is that it's an approved product, and then it's the person, we have to know that they're trained to use it and they're going to use it properly. That's always been the concern from the health department, having all those ducks in a row. So we don't generally allow the use of cleaning products by the staff. Does it happen? I'd be foolish to say it doesn't. Of course it does, but we also get gigged on it every year when the health department does their review of our buildings. But, our effort is going to be to provide enough disinfectant to accommodate the need or the plan, which would be at this moment, which would be once per day to disinfect the schools. That would be the effort. If something happens, then the custodial staff would be called in to address that something. That's the way we would normally handle it. If there was some concern in particular that a staff member had, we would address it that way. We're hoping to, the hand sanitizer thing, it seems a trivial matter, but we are, we're struggling with just about everything except, ironically, the face coverings, where those seem to have come around quicker, but probably because they're manufactured so much more simply than things like hand sanitizer and disinfectant. You may have seen some issues recently from hand sanitizer being offered that's offered with methanol, which is a poison, is poisonous to and causes really bad reactions. So when we're talking about things like chemicals of any sort, it becomes a lot more complicated. But the backup out there in the whole wide world is very, it's very real. The word rationing from one of our suppliers was used. We hadn't heard that before. But the only thing that we're feel very comfortable with at the moment are the face coverings. Everything else is a bit of a struggle. So we're sweating two different things here. The first thing is being able to open on September 8th in one fashion or form or another. And the second thing is the sustainability. We need to be able to keep resupplying both the disinfectant and that hand sanitizer. We don't know what that burn rate's going to be for both of those exactly. We're calculating, we're planning, we're attempting to know for sure. But until we start to experience that and have a dependable supplier for these things, there's definitely a question mark out there that we wouldn't normally have when things were normal.
That's why we're going to order more than less. And
we can.
Well, I was asking because I know, like, a lot of times with school supplies list, some things are asked for to have in the classrooms. If we could somehow, just for right now, it'd be okay if they got, the Clorox disinfectant wipes or, whatever could be potentially approved by the health department that it'd be okay to use. If parents could get one to donate to the classroom, would a teacher be willing to, wipe down the desk as the students are transitioning to a class or whatever? I mean, I was just wondering if, because we have certain things in place now, like if certain things can be loosened.
And again, that was always discouraged in the past, Tara. Again, it would have to be the chemicals that are on the approved list. And then secondly, there was always a concern if a person had brought in something privately, how is it stored, where is it stored? So there's always that safety element as far as if it's just sitting out, is it something, harmful certainly that the children could get to. So again, I know we're certainly, in some uncharted waters here, but I know that was always a concern, with the chemicals.
Yes.
And to raise earlier, we wouldn't say to a, how shall I say this? We're not going to police a teacher who may have a supply locked in his or her desk and they're wiping down a surface. We know that does happen. The flip side of that, though, Ms. Battaglia, is it could not become a job requirement. So, there might be another person who, for very good reason, would say that's not a function I'm okay performing, and we would recognize that that's true. That's not sort of in their job description, and if so yeah, it may happen, but it wouldn't be a formal thing in a plan to say teachers will now disinfect their desks themselves. We'll have to try to get folks in when those situations occur that are different than normal, and make sure we're doing the thorough sanitizing every night as well.
Okay, and I know we've touched on a number of items. Can we talk a little bit about food services and the cafeteria and, how that's going to look? Because what I'm seeing is that, again, the students would be expected to eat in the classrooms.
Right. We don't have a slide for that tonight, Dr. Dorsey. However, we're certainly happy to talk about that one tonight. I think Mr. Hartlove might be the best source if he's out there to fill in some gaps. Chris?
Sure. Specifically, can you repeat that? I just want to make sure I understood your question.
Our initial thoughts on how food service might work.
Well, basically, we're comfortable, based upon the last few months of operations, that we can operate in a virtual environment. We were also very comfortable that we can operate in our normal environment. The kind of in between creates some challenges for us, specifically with we would have our normal in-house cafeteria working, but then we would also have students who would be at home. So we would have to provide we would have to look to providing meals to those students at home at the same time we're providing meals for students during the day. We believe we can work through that, but ultimately having students at school is what we do best. There's challenges with regards to free and reduced students on days that they're not in the classroom. How do we get meals to them? There's also concerns on how do we bring the kids to the cafeteria, or do we deliver do we deliver meals to classrooms for to keep the kids from moving around? But of course that's another logistical concern there. But we're kind of in a reactionary mode. We'll react to how which direction we go. We believe we can operate in any of those modes. Each one would bring its own challenges, but we believe we can be successful in any of those modes. We just have to find out where the guidance is taking us, and then where we end up going.
Dr. Dorsey's question was similar to mine. I was curious about the cafeteria, but kind of in another light maybe. Mr. Singer and a few of my friends have convinced me that wearing a mask isn't the end of the world, although I hate it. Mm-hmm. I'd love to see all the kids back in school 5 days a week. I'm curious, like eating in the cafeteria, mask in the hallway when they're moving. What do you guys think? What can we give up if we can get the school open? Can we get by and not use the cafeteria? Can we try to do all recess outside? I mean, what's the options of things that, again, like we said, 8 kids on a bus doesn't cut it, we can't do it. But there are some things I think we can give up and maybe get our kids back in school where they belong.
So, certainly in a smaller fashion, we have delivered meals to classrooms. So that's certainly something. It's certainly a possibility that we could move away from use of the cafeteria. This would be on a much larger scale, but it's certainly something that we could look at, and that potentially can help, because you're bringing students together who may not be together at other times during the day. So that's just exposure to different students that you wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. So on the cafeterias, obviously bringing food to the classrooms would be helpful, and we believe that if it's required and necessary, we will do our best to pull that off.
Okay, and I think that also, I also question, I guess, the negotiated agreement with the 30-minute duty-free lunch period for teachers. Because, again, would the classroom teacher be the one expected to remain in the classroom while the students are eating their lunch? And is that the teacher's lunchtime then as well? Or?
Dr. Dorsey, if I could jump in just for a second. As a principal of a brand new building one year in my career, we opened the building, but the cafeteria and gymnasium weren't finished when we opened. And we spent the first 3.5 months eating lunches in our classrooms, with boxed lunches being delivered to the classrooms and milk, et cetera, for those students who were buying that day. And we had we created a schedule where instructional assistants and other staff covered the classrooms so during the lunch period, so that teachers could get their 30-minute duty-free lunch. So there are ways around that, and I've actually operated lunches at least at an elementary school out of classrooms when I was the principal there. It takes a little bit of coordination, but in most cases the kids are pretty easily adaptable to that. And so back to your point, Mr. Kyler, I think that's something that we could do to get back into our buildings in terms of what are some adjustments or accommodations that we could make. So we could figure out how to cover those classes. We could figure out the routine and the schedule pretty quickly.
Right. I know we can, because we've had to do that in the past as well. You know, certain days we couldn't go to the cafeteria, so we just had to provide coverage in the classroom. Again, I just wanted to make sure we didn't lose sight of, you know, again, the teachers needing their duty-free lunch periods, you know, if we can accommodate that.
Yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we're honoring the master agreements.
So the only other slide we have that hasn't already been discussed in some way is actually, Jason did refer to this one earlier, is this slide on some variables or unknowns. And this slide isn't meant to say that these are all things that will happen in the worst possible way. It's just simply to say that despite all of our best collective planning efforts, until we open, in whatever format we open, there will be a few things that we cannot be absolutely sure of until we get there, and we'll do our best to communicate and to maybe survey some more and poll and all the things we've talked about. But these are also some things that remain in the back of our minds, and you've heard them. I think all I think you've heard all of these somewhat tonight. I would like ultimately Jason to touch on that last one again, because I think it's the most important. But you know, student attendance, we'll see what that means, and it's probably going to be some in person and some virtual. What do leave rates turn out to be like? Absenteeism, contracted services, that would mean some of our major contracted services, such as our transportation, some of our student-related services, such as speech and language pathologists, as one example. How many of those folks are going to be available for whatever reason? You know, Ray and I just talked about trying to get ahead of ordering so that, you know, waiting to order isn't a problem. But we hope that all those markets show that we can get all the supplies we need all year long without ever having to worry about that. Mr. Singer's done a great job of talking about exposures and what that will mean, and we've talked about how at least for 2 days of school, according to MSD, should be shut down, and then Ed's talked about people being quarantined. And then, Jason, this last bullet is something you touched on before. I didn't know if you want to conclude one more time on that.
Yeah, thanks, John. I just want to remind the board that, you know, in our attempts to make sure that we're accommodating any possible scenario that we're placed in, you know, there will be, I'm certain, if we are in a modified schedule, some adjustments and modifications being made to, in particular, high school schedules. We know that, you know, with more sections, we're going to need more teachers teaching those sections to keep the numbers smaller. We want to make sure that we continue to provide all potential pathways for our students. We know how important it is that our students continue to see their pathway, and making sure that we're able to provide all the different electives that we've historically been able to provide. We're at this time making sure that we can do that, as Dr. Lockard said, you know, 2 months before we're even there yet. But that is something that's very much on our radar. Again, I'll go back to the earlier conversation. If we can get to 15 students into a classroom, I think that, and I think Ms. McCabe would agree with this as well, we are in a far better situation than if it was only 10. We feel like we can emulate that AB schedule. we feel like we can provide a day of conferencing office hours with our teachers. And only thing that would be any better than that is if we can get all of our kids back traditionally come September. So thanks, John.
Sure. And board members, originally as we laid this out, this would have been the last slide. We displayed this and we touched on it earlier. This was sort of going to be, when you add up all of those things, but especially the 6-foot social distancing rule, just in our initial pass as a staff of trying to look at the options MSD's presented, kind of the one that we know we're sort of resourced to meet would be that one-day rotation that Ms. McCabe had gone through earlier. So I think at this point, it'd be a great time, President Savigny, for me to stop and then say to you and the board, that's a first pass. We'll be back again many times, but maybe you have additional thoughts or questions, whether it was in this presentation or not. We'll be happy to try to answer as many of those as we could or react to your thoughts and record this discussion for our work going forward as well. So thank you so much for allowing that and for your very thoughtful questions. You got right to the issues we've been trying to wrestle with for a long time right away, and we appreciate the conversation very much.
Well, thanks, John. I think that was a really thorough presentation and conversation, and I appreciate many of the comments that were made tonight. But I think one of the ones that really resonated with me was one that Mr. Anderson just made about, like, we think that we could make this work and get students, if we could do the 15 students in a classroom, that's the one piece that kind of opens up a whole lot of doors and makes this so much more doable. So is there anything that we can rally around to try to see if we can get guidance that would be acceptable?
Well, I'm going to chime in, Ms. Savigny, to, I believe it was Commissioner Frazier earlier on the call made the point, and that was child care, and even Dr. Stimmer, when she referenced summer programming, I believe, stated up to 15. Now, I haven't found that written anywhere, and so it seems to me that that's something we need to pursue a little further to see, can we get that solidified somewhere, if that's a choice for us, because that certainly, as we've all been talking, would help us tremendously. But it is already in play for child care and summer programming. At least that's the way I recall hearing it announced a couple of weeks ago.
So, Dr. Lockhart, what would be the best process for that moving forward? Is there something that the board can do to help with that? Is there any?
Right. Well, I am actively seeking that clarification, and I'm working with my colleagues from around the state. Certainly, the board can support that through our work with MABE and or our local legislators as well. I'm certainly open to suggestions. There's a contradiction there, and Ms. McCabe referenced it. Mr. Anderson has referenced it. If you look at the square footage of our classrooms, and you apply the 6-foot rule, it doesn't equal 15 students. And so therein, I don't want to put anybody in any kind of safety issue, but at the same time, that's already that 15 student piece that we've been talking about has already been applied to right now to child care facilities and I believe some of the summer programming that was referenced. So we need that clarification. I'll seek that. I'll continue to seek that. I feel like I pretty much seek clarification 24/7 on everything. As Mr. O'Neill referenced, there's some conflicting clarification throughout a lot of these things. So we'll continue to do that. That would certainly help us moving forward. And while we're talking about this whole thing, I do want to take a minute just to thank John. Cindy and her team, and Jason and his team, Carrie Gaddis, everybody has really stepped up to the plate. John is sort of designated as the coordinator of this plan, and he and I probably talk 50 times a day, as with many of the folks here on this call. It's ongoing, sometimes, like I said, confusing in terms of clarifying what this means and what that means and what it doesn't mean, and trying to interpret it. But I really appreciate the effort he's put forward to bring this first blush and conversation at it. We've been working behind the scenes for a long time. And to folks listening to this, I think you'll see all of us would love for tomorrow to get back to normal. And we want nothing more than that. But at the same time, we're obligated to follow requirements put upon us, and we outlined some of those requirements tonight that exist in phase 2, stage 2, and we have to be prepared if we're still in that stage. I don't like the choices. I don't. The choice I like is back to normal, but at the same time, as superintendent of Carroll County Public Schools, I have to be responsible in following the guidance and the directives and what's laid out in terms of the requirements, and I want to do that. And I get not all the choices are great for everybody, so we'll continue to work hard on everybody's behalf. We'll continue to get the input. We'll continue to seek clarification. We'll continue to try to do the best that we can given our circumstances. And I can assure you, people are working around the clock trying to put that together. Appreciate all the board's questions, ideas, input, conversation as well. I think together, collectively, we've sifted through a lot of complex topics and concepts and scenarios tonight. It's certainly just the beginning of those conversations.
I have one more question, but I want to lead into it. I'm biased, but you guys were ahead on the virtual classroom than the rest of the state. I see board meetings with Sheriff DeWeese on it. Mr. Singer's been on a couple. Commissioner's on a couple. I think this county works better together than anybody else in the state. Do you see any hope coming from either Mr. Singer, maybe from the governor, or from the state superintendent, where individual counties will be given some more latitude? I feel for Baltimore City and PG County and higher hospitalizations and all that, but we've been ahead of the curve. Maryland's numbers are dropping. Carroll County West is different than the suburbs of D.C. Do you guys see any hope in us getting more latitude than the rest of the state, or is that hopeless? It's kind of like Ms. Savigny said, what do we argue for? Is that something worth fighting for, or you think that's hopeless?
Well, I know Mr. Singer I don't know if he's still here or not. I know he was actually joining us from vacation. I feel really bad about that, Ed. So I don't know if he had to leave or not.
I was going to say, if I could chime in on that, I know as a Board of Commissioners, we have written several letters to the governor and his staff that are looking into all these things for the coronavirus. We've asked for, because of our rates are so low in Carroll County, and maybe we can move a little quicker on this or that. To be very frank, we don't get a response at all until the next news conference comes up and we hear about it at the same time everyone else does. So we've been hitting on those points, saying that we flattened the curve long ago here. And even after the governor said that we crushed the curve, we still didn't get to move ahead any further than anybody else. So if the past is any indication of the future, and history teachers will say that it is, we're where we are. We're going to stay with the rest of the state.
Yeah, and I think we've had similar issues, Commissioner Frazier. We requested additional guidance from the state on graduations, an opinion, and never really got a response. And I agree with you. It feels like the goalposts have been moved a little bit, right? So we said that the whole goal was to flatten the curve, and we have flattened the curve. We haven't overwhelmed the healthcare system, but we're still not moving forward from that point. So But I don't want to give up on potentially having some sort of effect. Like you said, Mr. Kyler, is there something that we can rally around, and do we have any thoughts on how we could maybe be a little bit more effective in that regard?
This is Ed. I am have been in and out on the call. I don't know. I haven't seen anything other than it's funny. The delegations reached out to me on a number of occasions and said something about, well, the governor's office keeps saying we have flexibility. Well, the flexibility we keep being told that we have is to make things more restrictive than what they are anywhere else in the state. So Baltimore City and PG County and Montgomery County have had the option to open up more slowly or to make things more restrictive in their counties. However, statewide, I've had no authority to override the governor's executive order. And, it's very frustrating with the whole graduation things that you all went through, that we couldn't just get a straight answer. And I'd rather have the governor's office just come out and say, no, you can't do it, as opposed to having to have me sit here in front of you guys and say, no, the governor's office says you can't do it, but they're not going to tell you.
That is true, Mr. Singer. When we all brought this up, it's common courtesy, and that would have been nice just to, whether it was a yay or nay, and then we'd be done with it. But I just want to say a few words. I know this is tough, but we got to be safe, and we got to practice some type of social distancing. But we need to get these schools open and back to normalcy and a routine. And if we have students that are not comfortable, or parents that are not comfortable, sure, we can provide virtual learning for them. But those students, they really need to see their peers. They need to interact with their teachers. And there is no replacement for a classroom teacher. And there are thousands of parents out there that are agreeing with me right now, because they did not think that they would have to be a teacher again, or ever become a teacher, except for being a parent. But, we're human beings, and we're very social. And students and parents alike are having mental breakdowns. And don't tell me there's not stress in those houses, because you even hear about the pets, and the cat and the dogs are affected. So we need to get back to normalcy, and we need to use some common sense. And yes, there are a lot of unknowns, but if there's any way that we can help Dr. Lockard or Mr. Singer or any of you to get rid of that 6-foot social distancing. When you go to Walmart, when you go to church, when I went to a horse show, when you're in the grocery store, if you're on the softball field, they are not all practicing a 6-foot social distancing. As I said, we need more common sense, but we must go forward just for the sake of mental health for these students and teachers. And I want to thank everybody in this public school system that has worked so hard to get this far. And I know we got a lot of more work to do, but we have got to get these schools open, or we're going to have more mental breakdowns that you cannot expect. It's just going to be terrible. So, but we need to get them open.
And I think a lot of the state guidance also is, like, they're not recognizing how infeasible some of their suggestions are, right? Like, even with parents, okay, let's say we figure out a way to get the kids back in 2 days a week each, but then you look at the parents. Well, what are the parents supposed to do, like, if they're required to go back to their jobs and their kids are now going to be home 3 days a week? I mean, they're not thinking about the unintended issues and the infeasibility of what they're suggesting for parents. Like, okay, well, right. It makes sense from an education perspective, but it doesn't make sense from what parents can actually accomplish.
And that's why I said we need to get back to normalcy, and parents want to go back to work, and they do not want to be teachers anymore, because when I go out, and Donna, I know when we all go out into the public, I know I do, please open up the schools. Please open up the schools. I want to go back to work. I hear that all the time. So if I want to go and not run into anybody, you better go to Walmart at 5 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, or way late at night. And I don't blame them. That's our job. But parents want to get back to normalcy as much as the students do, because it has really affected the families.
Right, I think we saw some of that in the survey, right? I mean, there were 49% of people who said, open it up with no restrictions, just go back, right? And then there were another 30-some% that said, okay, well, maybe some limited. We're not really sure what we meant by limited, right? Like, did it mean, only one day back a week for the students, or did it mean, okay, well, everybody goes back, but they've all got to wear masks, right?
Great
So that's a pretty significant portion of our community that said we need to get back in the schools.
And part of that survey kind of scared me, that daycare wasn't that important. And I know in the spring semester, there were kids, 3rd, 4th grade, up through high school, they were home by themselves all day. And I had one parent tell me, well, once kids are old enough, you can leave them unattended all day. I'm not sure I can be left unattended all day. I mean, that's ridiculous. That's
true, Kenny. You should not be left alone all day.
And another point not lost on us at all is the volume of our teachers, all of our employees who are also our parents.
Right.
So it's kind of a double impact for those folks, and we know that even as we're trying to sort through all of those things.
Yeah,
right. I mean, we're requiring teachers to be in the classroom 4 days a week, but their small kids are only in school 1 day a week. What happens the other 3?
Right. And I know that, we have some of our community who would be open to, a phased in or a limited return, but I wonder how many would be in favor if it's only 1 day a week. That's something that we'll have to find out through further surveys.
Yep.
And that brings up an excellent question. So, Ms. McCabe, when are we planning to draft that survey, and how specific are we going to try to get? I think that we probably have to have a little bit more of a plan and ask very specific questions along those lines, right? Like, okay, you said that you wanted it, you would be comfortable with coming back in a limited fashion, but what did you mean by limited?
A thought we've had would be, tentatively on your timeline, we've scheduled ourselves to try and bring a draft to you at your July 15 update meeting, mainly because we have to have a plan by August and finished and posted, but also we figured that gave the better part of a month for public feedback on a first draft. That might be an opportune time with something a little more specific to say, here's a follow-up survey relative to some of these much more specific recommendations you can now, see for yourself and read for yourselves. Okay. I don't know, thoughts on that, President Savigny? That's an initial thought we've had.
Okay, so if we could have a plan at the July 15th meeting, an initial plan, obviously it wouldn't be final, but an initial draft of that plan on July 15th, and then we could also at that same time talk about the survey questions that we would want to go along with that?
Right.
Okay. Board members, I think that timing makes sense. Are you guys all okay with that?
Yeah. I think we just gotta, everyone's, trying to wrap their head around everything, and they're trying to figure out how to be flexible, and I think that's something we all need to keep in mind. I mean, I know there's contracts, and I know there's certain things that teachers, are required to have and everything, but we just need to, if we're asking our parents and our kids to be flexible, everybody needs to be flexible. But, no matter what the situation is, everybody has to be. I mean, I get, planning times and lunch times and everything, but if we're going to have lunch in our classrooms, and, then that's something that teachers might have to do as well. I mean, the flexibility, because of this pandemic, we need to make sure that's there, and everyone has an understanding of it.
And Mr. Tegley, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, Mr. Kyler said something earlier about how our county works really well together, right? When we band together and we work to solve the problems, we really do work well together. So I think we just need to understand what we're willing to ask of each other. and, to make this work. And if it's, if you can bring your kids to school rather than putting them on the bus, if that makes things better, then let's ask the community to do that. And if we think that we can make this all work, if we can't use the cafeterias, and that means some planning, like the not duty-free 30-minute lunch, like, okay, let's ask people to do that. Like, if we can kind of find those pain points that make this doable, let's find out what we can ask of each other as a community member to make this all work.
Exactly.
So, Mr. O'Neill, this is a completely different subject at this point, but well, not completely different, but not one that we really touched on, is we've received some emails in the last couple of days about, kindergarten enrollments being down in certain areas, and we might be making some staffing decisions based on that. And like, are we concerned that maybe the kindergarten enrollment numbers that we're seeing right now aren't legitimate because people are holding back on deciding whether to enroll their kids in kindergarten depending on what the plan is? And
Cindy might want to take that. I don't know if I myself could say they're not legitimate. I think there's also been obviously issues with access to us. Our buildings have been closed. Our school buildings have been closed to the public. So it just may be that, like most things in our lives right now, our normal course of how to do business isn't exactly in place. Cindy, you would be much more in touch with.
Yes. So our principals have been sending communications out to their communities regarding kindergarten registration, and we've sent out communications from central office as well. And we've really gotten, on the whole, great turnout from parents contacting our schools and telling our schools if they have children coming into kindergarten next year, or if they're just moving into the area and they might have a fourth grader. We've been getting really good communication from parents in general about that. But every year we tend to have at least one school, maybe two schools, where the kindergarten enrollment isn't matching what the projection was. That's not very unusual in what we do every year. And so when that happens, the first thing we try to do is look within a school and see, can we move a teacher from one grade level to another grade level to cover that shift in enrollment that we're seeing? Or can we use a teacher that we might not need at one grade level at another grade level? This year, we've had one circumstance where we're going to need to move a teacher from one elementary school to another elementary school because we're down, severely down in enrollments. And another school is up in their enrollment projection, more than we had planned. So, in the other school, we don't have enough teachers within the building to cover that higher enrollment, and that's why we're moving a teacher from one building to another. And I know that that's very hard during this time, this pandemic, when nothing's been normal anyway. I would just say that we don't like to have to do it, but it is a normal part of our, summertime kind of work that we have to do to try to make sure that class sizes aren't too large anywhere.
And in the macro view, I guess, President Savigny, I don't know that worried is a good word. Anxious, very, very interested to see what our overall enrollment is in many different ways. Quite frankly, how will the state even calculate enrollment this fall? Because it looks like it may be vastly different than any other year in history. And, part of me does wonder what impact this pandemic and the ramifications of this pandemic may or may not have on what Bill Kane likes to call net migration, or where people did or didn't move, this year, as opposed to the trends we have been seeing the last few years. So I know we got to get to July 15 first, and then after that, but that's something that lingers in the back of my mind. What will September 30 enrollment be this year?
Right. And so, I think that's where the surveys are really going to come into play as well, just to make sure that, that we understand something, what's going to potentially surprise us, right? Like, so who is going to enroll, who's going to be happy with the plans that we're putting forward, and who, what is the student attendance and enrollment actually going to be, and are we going to be able to be agile and nimble at the last second, right, given any surprises that might get thrown our way. I would imagine that our ability to be agile and nimble at that point would be very dramatically reduced.
Well,
but the surveys are going to be really important.
Those surveys will be very important, and then circling back to a point idea Ms. Pataglia raised, and then at some point, once that plan is approved, prior to school starting, hopefully well in advance of school starting, that we can get a more formalized, again, I'll just use the word registration for this exercise, of the choices that people are going to make based on the options we have available, and then that'll really help us figure those puzzles out, if you will.
And, I think as well, I think when people make a decision, they sort of make it at the moment. They make the best decision that they can make at the moment. But who's to even say, as it gets closer to September 8th, that their plan changes or their decision changes. So again, talk about flexibility. Yes, we definitely need a big dose of that.
Okay, so board members, any other questions or comments at this point? So Dr. Lockhart, as a matter of course, for the July 8th board meeting, that's going to be more business as usual, the things that we need to tick off, right? That's not really going to be a whole lot of COVID updates at this point. That's what the July 15th meeting is meant to be.
That's correct. We have our regular business meeting on the 8th, and then the following week we're back with a draft plan, draft survey questions to go out on the 15th.
And so, board members, it didn't seem like there were any other questions or comments at this point.
I just want to say one thing. I know our educators, our teachers are very concerned also about what's going to happen. They are in the dark also, and I feel for them because they had to jump into something that they had never done before with virtual education, and now we're in a position of, well, where are we going to be? So hang in there, and we are going to try to make the best decisions, and we're with you. But I'm telling you, these are very difficult decisions we have to make, and it affects everybody in this county. People don't understand that. It affects parents, the students, the teachers, the babysitters, everybody. And this has to be a decision that we make wholeheartedly, and that we make this through asking questions and work with Mr. Singer and the community and the commissioners. Because this is, we're going to be in a no-win situation, but we have got to put our best foot forward and, try to put our largest employee in the county at ease, because if I was a teacher, I would be worried about what to expect, and it's all the unknown. So just hang in there. We got to do that.
Right. Right.
Well said, Ms. Herbert. We are working as fast as we can, and conversations like this and meetings like this help us. But like I said before, we are constantly trying to seek information, get clarification to help us make these decisions. And so, Ms. Gaddis has worked diligently. We are trying to communicate as much information when we have it as we can, in as timely a fashion as we can. The nature of this whole thing, as it sort of ever changes and constantly evolves, I think I referenced, 1 week to the next can be like a world of difference. So that's challenging. That's certainly challenging. But you're correct. Our employees are tremendous. I get the impact it has on our entire community. All of us personally wrestle with all these things with our own families, our own situations, our own work lives. And so that's not lost on me in any of this. That's sort of right in the front of everything we're thinking about. So, right next to our kids.
And in the spirit of having a hybrid model, Dr. Lockard, does it make sense to talk about what we're thinking about doing coming board meetings? We're going to try to get back into the boardroom with Board of Education members and you, Superintendent Lockard, and well, we're gonna meet the social distancing requirements. We're gonna meet the, stay under 10 people requirements. But we're gonna try to get our next board meeting back into the boardroom on July 8th, at least for a portion of us. And that wouldn't necessarily have some impact on citizen participation, right? Like we want to talk about how we would potentially invite citizen participation moving forward, but we'd have to be very careful about how we do that so that we don't violate any of the social distancing guidelines.
Correct. So we are working on a communication that we'll hopefully have out by this Friday that will outline that process. But in general terms, for the next board meeting on July 8th, there will be some board members who will be coming in, and like you said, Ms. Savigny, will follow the social distancing guidelines. Others and staff will continue to be virtual so that we can honor, folks' choices there, but also not exceed the 10-person limit. We have probably, 30 people on this call. And so it'll kind of be that hybrid model. To that end, we'll continue to allow folks who want to provide public comment through the email option that we've been giving and posting to our website. We'll continue to do that. We're working on a protocol for those who want to come give in-person public comment. The ability to do that, we would announce the public comment time so that people wouldn't have to wait. We'd have, and like I said, we're working on these protocols and we'll communicate this. So I'm speaking in loose general terms here. That we'd have a process where one person could come in and give public comment, leave. The next person could come in, give public comment, and leave. And so we'd have like I said, sort of a queue and a protocol that meets the social distancing requirements established, and we'd communicate that. So we're working on putting that together now. That's a little sort of glimpse, if you will, moving forward to how we'd like to try to operate.
All right, so Dr. Lockard or board members, any other comments or issues that we want to address this evening? And if not, then I will say, okay, you had a list of all the upcoming meetings, I think on one of the slides, Mr. O'Neill, but I'll announce them very quickly right now as part of our new business or unfinished business. So we have a meeting scheduled for July 8th at 5 p.m., which is our regularly scheduled board meeting. And as we just discussed, some board members will convene as necessary in the boardroom, and then we'll have that hybrid approach details to follow. That will be the same for each of the other upcoming meetings, which will be on Wednesday, July 15th, which we also discussed earlier this evening, and that'll be at 5 p.m. The next after that will be Wednesday, July 29th at 5, Wednesday, August 5th at 5 p.m., and Wednesday, August 12th at 5 p.m. will be the next regularly scheduled board meeting after that. So those are the board meetings that we have scheduled on the plan, and those will all be, we're anticipating that those will all be following the hybrid sort of approach, and as we said, more detail to follow. So with that, board members, are we comfortable, and someone wants to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Herbert.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Kyler. All those in favor, can I get a verbal aye, please?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, that passes unanimously. Thank you very much, everyone. We are adjourned, and thank you for all the hard work that's going on, and I look forward to further discussions in just a few weeks.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.